quorum, and let's start with item 1, the wastewater reclamation facility, local limits for number of pollutants. And I wrote down who's at the table with us. Terry Price, Marion Rice, and Jesse Stewart. Please come on up. Pick the mic of your choosing. And Sam Owen from our office. Sam, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
So for this item in 2010, the Department of Public Utilities started looking at standards for local limits on pollutants that can be discharged in wastewater. Came to the council in 2015 for suggestion, proposed revisions to the local limits for the pollutant discharge in wastewater. The council members raised some concerns with a couple of the items, and the Department of Public Utilities revised the proposal, presented the proposal to the council again about 1 year ago, April of 2017. Council received that briefing without comment, and in the time since, the State Department of Environmental Quality has conducted the necessary public noticing and outreach. So the Department of Public Utilities is back to talk about and answer questions on the revised proposal for the updates to the local limits.
Thank you. Sam. Jesse, anything?
Real quick, let me do a couple introductions. So I'm Jesse Stewart. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Utilities. I've got Marion Rice, our Water Quality and Treatment Administrator, and Terry Price is our Pre-Treatment Manager.
Welcome.
For the sewer program. So we can go through a little background, if that would help.
That'd be great.
So again, thanks for having us here. Appreciate having the opportunity to come back in and talk to you all about this. The pre-treatment program, for those who haven't been involved in this has been a journey some of us have been on for the last couple of years. But the pre-treatment program is a federally mandated program under the Clean Water Act to have a program put in place to limit the quantity and type of contaminants coming into the sewer collection system and ultimately to the water reclamation facility. It's also in 40 Code of Federal Regulations 403. And per these requirements, we've since 2010, been working on our pre-treatment limits. And those are for various types of contaminants, heavy metals, chemical oxygen demand, and some other types of contaminants that can impact our ability to treat the wastewater as it goes through our facility and out into the effluent and into the receiving waters. So that's kind of where we started off in 2010. Again, as Sam mentioned, we came in 2015 with some proposed limits based on some guidance from council. Some of the limits had actually gone up based on the methodologies we were using to calculate them based on EPA methodologies. We went back after the council's suggestions, worked with Division of Water Quality at the Department of Environmental Quality, Division of Water Quality, and worked with them to revise the limits such that they would accept them, they could have faith and understanding of how they were calculated, and they could, I guess, justify them to anybody that might come to them. We were able to come back in 2017 after working with them to council and seek guidance again on moving forward with those. You approved those, we went back to DEQ, they've since approved them, and now we're looking for the council to
We're the last step.
the last step, yes, exactly.
And can you remind us of the council concerns in 2015 more specifically?
Do you want to remember that?
So there were concerns. Some actually increased the limits. So in particular, arsenic, selenium, and cadmium were the three of concern.
I remember, I mean, they were my concerns, but not everyone was here.
So yes,
And it
Use-
was something also about projected growth and new businesses down the road
Correct.
needing to occupy the same stream.
growth in industry. Correct.
So we addressed all those working with DWQ, and we ultimately didn't increase any of our contaminants with the exception of silver. That went from a 5 milligram per liter limit to no limit, and that's just because it's not truly a contaminative concern in our waste stream. Terry, you might have more information on that.
Yeah, so the criteria that's used to calculate our local limits, which...
Terry, will you pull?
Mary, can you hear it? I
Thank
apologize.
you.
The criteria used to calculate local limits, which is based upon the concentration of potential contaminant coming into the water reclamation facility, the ability of the water reclamation facility to remove any particular contaminant, the effluent that leaves the water reclamation facility into the receiving body, as well as the biosolids that we dispose of. So we have to calculate or evaluate a potential impact from any pollutant on those three sources. DEQ does not have any effluent limit for silver, so there's no regulatory driver for that discharge. In addition, there's no design criteria for the plant. Therefore, silver was evaluated and determined not to be a potential or a contaminant of concern. In addition, in our influent sampling, that silver's been non-detect at the method detection limit for years.
How many years?
At least the last
Said years,
several years,
okay.
yes. I don't know the full history of it, but for the last several years.
Okay. Council, any questions?
And we're mandated to look at the local limits every 5 years. We actually look at them every year just to make sure we're meeting everything, but we will evaluate them once every 5 years.
This is, as many public utilities items that come before us, a bit wonky. So, council members, there are no dumb questions. Even I don't know very much about a lot of what you guys do at all. So is there any questions you want to ask about in this briefing? Councilmember Wharton?
Out of curiosity, why, if silver isn't really a contaminant, why was there ever a limit on it in the first place?
It's a good question.
So the state does not have a limit, and for us, we have not detected this, which is why we do not have a limit. We will, as Jesse mentioned, we are required every 5 years to go in and assess our limits. We do this annually to make sure that the limits are protective, and we will do this again. So if we see an indication that silver is a concern, we could revise those.
Because before it had a limit,
Correct.
but you don't know why it had a limit in the first place, if it wasn't a problem?
You know, some of these limits were derived a decade or longer.
Okay.
That's why in 2010 we started reevaluating the local limits, was to really get a technical basis for the determinations. So to answer your question, I don't have a good answer other than now it's technically based.
Yeah, they are technically based limits that we'll be looking at.
Okay, thanks.
And the other thing, just a little more clarity, so the public outreach we did on this, we actually talked to all of our permit holders and even some of the ones that we thought might have issues. So we did a lot of public outreach with industry to make sure that no surprises would come to them, and I think there was acceptance all around. from the
Yes, that is
industries.
correct.
Great. Anything else, council members? I'll ask, go ahead, Councilmember Johnston.
I was just thankful for the thoughtful explanation of the changes. I think it was well laid out, so it's easy to follow.
Yeah.
So appreciate that very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
What do you, I don't mean to be off the topic, but maybe even within the list of pollutant concerns, what's our biggest threat going forward as we look at growth? Okay, barring any legislative changes at the state level, from a contaminants perspective, what's really growing here?
We see a increase in arsenic that's likely due to groundwater infiltration into the sanitary sewer system, not necessarily related to industrial users. That's a concern for us.
And that's
Go ahead.
something that with all of our capital improvement projects for our collection system, we're hoping to minimize that.
Mm-hmm.
Arsenic is it's a high naturally occurring element
Yeah.
in the West. And you'll see that in soils or groundwater, whatever it might be. And I think that's something that we're working on through our capital program and operations and maintenance of our collection system to mitigate that.
And for me, for clarification, are you speaking in terms of local limits and industry? Or are you thinking threat to the environment as a whole?
I was thinking more holistically,
More holistically,
assuming that the permitting process on the industrial side is a lens through which we can anticipate those coming potential contaminants, but through the environmental broadly speaking side.
so I'll jump into
Harder.
this one. So more holistically, so what the state does in EPA and holistically in the environment, we look at point sources. So pretreatment and point sources is one threat, but really we also have a bigger threat as well in terms of non-point sources. So you will notice as you go from the headwaters into the more urban area, we have increased pollutant loads into our surface waters. And again, this is non-point source, so something people don't think about are day-to-day activities. So fertilizer on the ground, that introduces nutrients into our source waters. We have pet waste and animal waste that go in. Sediment is actually a big pollutant of concern, and people don't realize that. Even organic material, so grass clippings and leaf litter, is a pollutant of concern. And reason being, and we notice in the lower Jordan River, where our water bodies have been more channelized, they're no longer connected to the floodplain, and because of this, we have sediment that just stays on the stays in the creek, and that takes a lot of oxygen, as does this organic material, and that's what we call biological oxygen demand. So we see that in the Jordan River and other places. So non-point source is a concern, and the state and EPA know that as well. These are voluntary programs, but I think one thing the city is really good at is we're very proactive of taking opportunities to try to address these pollutants of concern.
And that answer addressed more surface water, stormwater, creeks. I don't know if you were looking more of a sewer.
Oh, that was a great answer.
Okay.
I like that
It
answer.
wasn't quite a pre-treatment.
My question probably wasn't either, though.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page there.
Okay, one nerdy question. Microbeads in makeups and face washes and things, is that something that we end up needing to filter or treat for, or is it something that gets through our system because of the size of those particles and is a downstream effect?
That's a good question. That is something that EPA, NACWA, which I'll mess up the acronym, but they're the North American Water Alliance. They work with EPA, and they're actually evaluating microbeads and some of these, what they call emerging contaminants now, to help cities and POTWs determine what is required to remove these potential contaminants from wastewater in the future and protect the environment. So that is something that EPA states and the city is aware of, and we are continuing to monitor and trying to determine what needs to be regulated, and if it needs to be regulated, how do we go about it?
Well, as a single council member, not speaking for the body, I'll tell you that I would love to hear future developments from public utilities about that and any other emerging pollutant issues. For my peers, it was really fascinating to learn about the microbeads like in our face wash, that is really fabulous when you're washing your face, but that they go through a lot of the water treatment systems. They end up in our oceans, and even the smaller biological organisms in the oceans will consume them as though they are little bits of food, and their guts fill with these microbeads, and they end up being starving but full. And there's a whole bunch of interesting implications from our face wash.
And we're very involved with different organizations to look at emerging contaminants, both on the Safe Drinking Water Act side for our culinary water and for our stormwater and sewage also. So we'd be happy to come in and
That would be
give an
great.
update as we get them.
Public Utilities of Salt Lake City is always at the cutting edge of these water conversations, and we appreciate you being here with us. Terry, Marion, Jesse, Sam, thank you. And unless there's any other questions, we will move on from this. Thank you for being with us. It looks like we could take council action later today at our formal meeting.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you for being here. We are going to shuffle our bicycle licensing ordinance so that Councilmember Luke can be here with us. And I understand that our auditors are in the audience, so if you wouldn't mind jumping with us to item 4 on our agenda, the city's annual financial audit report. And we would like to invite Paul Skeen and Michael Michelson from Edie Bailey to come on up.
I'm flying solo today.
I don't know. Are you Paul or Michael?
I'm Paul.
Forgive me.
Yep,
Thank
yep,
you. When you
nope.
show up together all the time, it's hard to
It's
remember.
yin and yang. We're usually a
those
tag
twice a
team.
year,
That's right.
RDA or council. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yep, absolutely. We had to shuffle the time a little bit today to make things work, and that's why Mike's not able to make it. So
We appreciate your flexibility.
absolutely, my blood pressure elevated for a second as I thought, oh crud, how am I going to get this? But we're here and we've got everything we need. So
If history
happy
is
to do it.
any indicator, this will be you telling us about all the work you've done and very few questions.
you have been here before.
I have, once or twice.
No, we appreciate that, and I just for sake of introduction, I'll talk through the process at a high level, and then some of the results of what we went through, and then open it up for any questions you may have. Just a few required communications is we confirm that we are independent of the city and any of the component units that we perform audit procedures on. We don't have a vested financial interest or conflicts with management or anything of that nature. As we start the audit, it's fun to report in April, since we'll be starting here in another month or two on the next year's audit, but it really does become a year-round process as we work with management, and we try and get as much work done before year-end as possible so that there isn't such a time crunch. One thing to discuss is that the report was later than usual. And we've already met with each of the component units and departments that have separate audits that feed into the city's CAFR, and established a timeline for this next year to where that will not be a problem. So everyone's on board. We've got deadlines for each of the different component units, and our schedule has been set internally to where we'll be able to keep up with those deadlines, assuming each of the component units does as well. So we're on that. There were a couple of findings that we had. There are three types of reports that we issue. We issue an audit report on the overall financial statements, and that report was clean with no findings. That essentially says that based on the procedures that we performed, the financial statements, this heavy-duty thing that hopefully you got emailed instead of having to throw your back out carrying this around, is materially correct, that we've tested it, that we've performed audit procedures sufficient to say that the way that it is presented is materially correct in accordance with government accounting standards. The second report that we issue is on federal compliance and internal control over federal programs. And this one pulls in some of the findings that were already reported with the RDA, that there were some material audit adjustments in the RDA that had impact on federal programs. Therefore, we did have material weakness noted there because of the audit entries that were required. There were no improprieties or question costs. It's just more related to the internal control over the financial reporting process. And then we also had a significant deficiency that has not been reported to council or one of the other governing bodies. Is in the city, there was, in May of 17, the state allocated additional funds from the Class B and C Road Fund to each of the municipalities. Hidden kind of in the disbursement was that it should be applied to fiscal year 17. City received the money and set it up as a deferral until 18. So there was a required adjustment to push that back into 17. Again, that's a timing thing. There was no impropriety or misclassification. It was just getting it in the right period. So we didn't feel like that was a material weakness, but it was a deficiency we felt should be noted. And then the third report that we issue is on state compliance, and we did not have any issues with state compliance matters. The other required communications is there were no disagreements with management. It's not to mean we didn't have some healthy discussions along the way, but at the end of the day, we were all able to see eye to eye and come to the same conclusions. And that there were no other significant matters that we felt needed to be reported before the council. I think it's important to say, and I say this every time, a couple times a year, that we are, though we spend the vast majority of our time working with management, we are not hired by management. We don't report to management, we report to you. And so we try to make ourselves available. If any of the council members had questions throughout the year, Mike and I are both available to address those at any time. So with that, I will open it up to any questions you may have.
Council members? We went from water wonky to financial.
It's a strange journey, isn't it?
There's just so many wonderful topics
Yeah.
we get to learn about as council members.
I'll bet.
Councilmember Johnston?
I'm just happy to hear a good audit, so,
Yeah, yes, you should be.
yeah, so the absence of news is good news here.
Okay, so as to the finding around the internal controls within the RDA, just for the reporting's sake,
Uh-huh.
I suppose we should follow up with the RDA staff on that
Yes,
one.
and I think that there are already mechanisms in place. Mike handles the audit of
I
the
think so.
specific RDA, and I know that they've been working hard with those over that, as well as the city financial team as a whole, on how to make sure that those are alleviated. And I think that a great deal of attention has already been given to that, and we'll certainly continue to follow up. That's one of the required thing. When we have a finding, that's one of the first things we do in assessing our planning and setting up our scope for the next year, is we evaluate what efforts have been made to mitigate that finding in future years. Plus, it's low-hanging fruit as auditors, right? If we get a finding right off the bat, well, we're halfway done, so. Not really, but
No one else behind you can see you smiling, but
I'm smiling.
I appreciate it.
So thank you.
But perhaps for staff, or for Amy, as RDA Vice Chair, we could ask for a brief recap or even a written briefing from RDA staff on how that issue is addressed at our next week meeting for the RDA.
Perfect.
Great. Anything else? Thank you, Paul.
Thank
you
you.
for accommodating our time change today.
Absolutely.
And for your
Yep.
persistent work on our financial behalf.
It really is our pleasure, so thank you. All right.
Okay, shall we jump back to, we're going to go to item 3. We're going to defer that bicycle licensing a little longer and go to CDBG and other grants. It looks like we have Ben Ludke from our council staff at the desk. Perhaps Melissa Jensen from HAND will join us, and Lonnie Egerton-Goff. Come on up. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, does everybody have their CDBG packets?
Everybody have a spreadsheet?
Ben, I imagine you're going to walk us through.
Yes. I've got a quick intro. The council, as a reminder, held a public hearing on March 20th. There were about 24 people who came and spoke. This is the first briefing, and there's a second briefing scheduled for April 17th, and then a potential council vote on May 1st. This is the 4th year under the city's 5-year consolidated plan. And as a reminder, it targets the funding into the Poplar Grove and Central City neighborhoods. And there's a map of that in your packet in the additional info section of the staff report. As in most years, the requests for funding in CDBG and ESG significantly outstrip the available funding for those requests. But for Home and Hopwa, the requests almost perfectly match the available funding. So everybody's getting something in Home and Hopwa, but in ESG and in CDBG especially, it's much more competitive. There's a minimum funding level. It's $30,000. You'll notice there are a few projects that were disqualified for requesting less than the minimum funding level. And this was a new part of the program that was started last year. And the intent was to have a bigger impact because there were some people or some organizations who would submit applications with very small amounts, maybe $7,000. And when you take into account the cost to actually administer that amount, you start eating away at the impact and the benefit the community actually receives. So a $30,000 minimum is the city's current level. The administration did a significant amount of public outreach. More than twice as many people were contacted this year than last year. Last year there were 710, and this year it was just over 1,800. So a significant increase in our public outreach efforts. And I just wanted to point out attachment 1. This was helpful last year. It's the combined scoring for the projects. The board and the mayor each score the applications, and you can see the scores on attachment 1.
Sorry, just to clarify, the mayor does not score. There's an administrative score and a board score. So we do an administrative scoring, my team does, based on real firm things, black and white things. Does it meet the regulations? How did they perform? We do a risk analysis that's qualified by HUD. And then the board scores, and so they're merged.
Mayor funding recommendations, staff scoring. Thank you.
Can I back you up to the public outreach part of it?
Yes.
After the public hearing last week? 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
When, we were done by 8:30, and we're a few staff people who've been here for a while, and probably you, Andrew, can remember the CDBG nights in the days of yore when we'd go till the cows came home, because we had so many applicants, and we would issue these smaller funding requests, and there were really dozens and dozens and dozens of nonprofits that would show up. And we were lamenting to an extent how you could feel like there's so many points in the city where we're able to supplement the need. And now, but I do understand the financial balance that we're achieving here. And yet, we can almost count on a few hands, a few fingers, all that are receiving funding. So there's that kind of, why are we doing community councils kind of level outreach when we're really targeting a very small portion of the service community, fewer than ever? So tell me about, I'm not trying to cut out public input, but we're narrowing our scope but broadening our public outreach at the same time.
That's a great question. And in fact, it's kind of like we did the opposite. We used to have a public outreach night, if you remember, and all the agencies would show up and no public, general public, right? So we weren't doing a very good job. So last year we spent the time sort of intercepting, but we didn't want to say, what is your need in general, right? We really wanted it to funnel to what we thought funding sources could respond to. So we kind of break out the pieces of the consolidated plan, and we ask people to speak specifically to the areas that the applicants are addressing. And so when the board looks at their the funding applications as they come in and they review the applications, they contemplate the priority of the public with the scoring.
So the public outreach, I am misunderstanding. The point of it is to give public sentiment context to the board for their scoring, not to solicit applicants for CDBG.
Correct.
Exactly.
My mistake.
Correct. No, I'm glad we could clarify. And it's much more effective this way, and people get it. Like, I care about parks and public lands. It's very clear to somebody.
Great. Thank you. Continue on, Ben, if there was more that I cut you off from.
That's just a quick intro. I don't know if it's more helpful for the council to focus on the policy issues next, or if you want to run through the individual applications for the grants. We've done it both ways in prior years.
Anybody have an opinion on this? I want to start with the policy then. This was a great staff report, by the way.
Thank you. The first policy question is about funding contingencies. We don't have the final awards from HUD about how much money the city will actually receive, so we're working off of estimates.
Which is typical, right?
Which is typical. And the board, which is really helpful, has provided recommendations about what to do if we get more or less than those estimates. And those are included in your packet, and I'm going to pull it up right here. And they have one for each of the 4 grants, and you don't have to decide right now, but it's really helpful for the administrative staff. If there's $2 more than we estimated, they'd have to come back to the council to use that $2 or wait to use it next year. But if the council approves these funding contingencies, they'll have the go-ahead to use any extra money.
Melissa, do you want to give us a little presentation or a nutshell version of the funding contingency, maybe the history? How common is it that our predictions are accurate, and what's the big takeaway from this?
Sure. I would say that in years past, we have never counted on receiving more. So your decreased contingencies are tend to be more valuable. As the board contemplated their own contingencies, they really spoke to the scoring, and they felt that the contingencies, especially for increases, should correlate with the higher scores. And so that's what you'll see reflected in their sort of policy considerations. The decreases are a little more strategic based on what they thought a program could support, right? So if a project was not able to be completed, if it was decreased, then it didn't make sense to allocate, okay, we were off by 10%, so we decrease everybody by 10%. So they were a little more contemplative in that respect. This year, there was some increases in the budget overall, which was sort of shocking to everybody involved with federal funding processes. We don't know how that will transpire to Salt Lake City as an entitlement city directly. So I guess there is a scenario where it could be slightly more, but I can't imagine that it would be lots and lots of money. Is that helpful?
Yes, so council members, based on that possible, welcome Derek Kitchen, by the way. Based on the possibility of there being more, but the reality that there may be less as well, and looking at the contingency plans here for the 4 different funds, does anybody have any changes? Are we comfortable with this suggestion? Okay. You're comfortable? I am. Should we straw poll this? Would that be helpful?
It's helpful to straw poll, but we can also include the funding contingencies in the motion sheet.
Let's do that. And I'll take a straw poll, or can I ask anybody else want to propose a straw poll to support these?
Madam Chair, I would propose a straw poll that we support the advisory board suggested funding contingencies.
For CDBG,
For CDBG.
ESG, Home and HAPA.
Yes.
Okay, all those in favor? Any discussion, I should say? Everybody okay with that? Give a thumbs up. And that's everyone with Councilmember Kitchen abstaining as he just walked into the discussion. Great. Let's continue on through the policy.
That takes us to the second policy question, which is about encouraging more transportation projects. On the last page of the big spreadsheet, you'll see the 5 objectives under the 5-year consolidated plan. I'm also pulling it up here. And you'll see transportation is one of those 5 objectives that we need to show advancement to HUD, that we're achieving our goals, and that's one of the ways they say, yes, you're doing a good job and we'll continue to give you grant money. There's only been one application that fulfills the transportation objective the last few years, and it's the city's Hive Pass. And I'm not sure why there's not as much interest, but I just wanted to highlight that as far as all the objectives, this one seems to just not have as many applicants for some reason. And in past years, I've seen applications from UTA and interest from the Bicycle Collective, but not in recent years.
Please, go ahead.
Does that have anything to do with the $30,000 limit at all? I'm just curious as to why we're not seeing more projects from the Bicycle Collective, for example. So I don't know if they were receiving less than that and they just don't have a big enough project idea, or maybe what we're seeing there.
And would you like me to speak to that?
Yeah,
A little bit.
I don't know.
The little bit of information we heard during what we call the nano sessions, or the kind of speed dating for federal funding interactions with applicants, is that, yeah, somewhat as to your question, it really doesn't make sense for them to pursue something if they can't make that 30,000 or more work for their small organization. The Bicycle Collective did not have the capacity, for instance.
And then I'll just add, conversely, in years past, we've received feedback, and this, I don't know if it's still relevant, but in years past, we received feedback from UTA that the grant award amount was not large enough for it to make sense for an organization like UTA to apply for it, for example, for different programs that they had in CDBG eligible areas. So it's just kind of a chicken and egg thing.
I had a thought that, that obviously there's some kind of a sweet spot organizational size there, but with, as Ben brings up in that, the end of that policy question statement around our considerations around implementing some of the transit master plan here and wanting to leverage every source of possible dollars to make that go far, maybe there's some kind of a conversation we could have with UTA or whoever that transit entity is about taking advantage of applying through CDBG for some specific components of the master plan implementation. Go ahead, please.
Thinking that the sort of threshold of the $30,000 was some, or yeah, is that right?
Correct.
Was something internally decided.
Well, what I would say is that we actually received a lot of push from Housing and Urban Development, and actually the minimum that they request is $35,000. So their minimum is actually higher than ours, and so every year we get pushback that we should be doing larger grants. And it was also done based on considerable outreach with our applicants. So we did a lot of outreach and we kind of had people pull what they thought was the right amount. And the most popular amount was $25,000 and HUD's recommendation is $35,000. So we kind of felt the $30,000 was a pretty good moderating number.
Okay. I guess I'm just sort of thinking like if this is a priority, and it certainly is a priority for us, it's a priority, one of HUD's priorities. I remember I sat down with you guys a couple of weeks ago and went through like where we are on the list of all these different projects. If there would be a way to sort of, if a project area addressed are those transportation goals, if we could kind of move that limit around or be more flexible with that limit, if that's even a possibility. Does that make sense? Like if it's addressing just specifically a transportation goal, then, but it's from the Bicycle Collective and maybe they only really want or need $15,000 or something along those lines, if that's even a possibility or if that's just futile.
Well, I think everything's a possibility, really. I think what I would say is what we've learned from organizations when they take on less than 30,000, they're not comfortable with the reporting requirements and the time that goes into it. So they might think that they want 15,000, and then at the end, what we've learned is they kind of come back and say, you know, it's not worth it. However, to your point about exploration, it might be worthwhile saying, how do we think about the bigger, larger infrastructure projects, and maybe thinking more collaboratively about how we get more applicants for that so that we can continue to address the objectives, because I think there's got to be ways where we can increase the number of applicants in this category.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Wharton, please.
Can we look at other cities and see sort of what groups they have that are working with transit to try to apply for these types of grants, and encourage, if we have those groups here, for them to reach out to them specifically and encourage them to apply in this area?
Sorry, your question was related to best practices nationally,
Well,
but then
sort of.
also
I'm just wondering if we want more more applicants to speak to the transit component. Are there other cities that are there agencies or nonprofits out there that in other cities are applying for CDBG under to meet the transparency goal that maybe either we don't have here or that we're not reaching out to?
It's a great question, and we'll, I think it's worth looking into, so we'll take a look. We did a CDBG sort of best practices study a few years back, and we were really surprised actually that the majority of comparable cities were investing in economic development.
Okay.
Which has not been our number one thing, but we didn't look specifically for transportation initiatives, so I think that's a great way to circle back.
Okay.
I spy John Larson in the audience, our Director of Transportation. Could I implore you to come and join us, John? And if we have any other transportation questions, but if you have any ideas, or I know that with your work before you were at the city, you've always been aware of all the transportation kind of partners, small and large, all the fish sizes out there in the ocean. Do you have any thoughts for this council who really does want to deepen the pool of transportation applications for CDBG and how we might go about that, looking that we're trying to implement our transit master plan.
Yeah. I have to admit, CDBG is not something that I've really dealt with much previously.
I don't need you to know anything about
okay.
CDBG, except for those 3 points, the plan objectives around supporting access to public transportation for vulnerable populations, increasing the accessibility of public transit in distressed neighborhoods, and expand and improve multimodal transportation infrastructure. Those are the only criteria
Okay.
from a very basic level.
So I think I would focus on, what's known as first, last mile solutions. So those are really anything that makes it easier to get to and from either your home or your destination from the transit station. So that could be improved sidewalks, bicycle infrastructure. I think maybe even green bike potentially. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not green bike could expand on the west side. So those are the first things that would come to my mind.
I'm only giggling because I literally just leaned over to Jen and was like, so wouldn't green bike be a thing that we could do this? And we were just discussing that exactly what Melissa said, and Jen pointed this out, was that a lot of, like, green bike, for example, probably wouldn't think about applying for CBDG grants, although, as Melissa stated, doing some of that outreach to those organizations and those potential applicants to say, this is what it looks like, this is how time intensive it might be, but we think you can handle it, and then here is like the benefit that would bring, like putting green bikes over on the west side, especially with some of the trails and hopefully new mass transit that will be going in on that side, right? So that's why I was giggling.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I literally just was whispering that over here.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Yes, please.
I'd just like to point out to the council that it looks like the Bike Collective did apply for their Goodwill Bike program, and it wasn't recommended to fund them. So if we have a desire to shift funding that exists in this application, it's on page 7,
Thanks.
number 14.
And Lonnie can speak to why that was
Thanks.
not funded.
And I mentioned this earlier when Councilmember Fowler asked about it, that the staff that did respond basically felt like they didn't have the capacity to deal with a new CDBG. This was their first application. They scored quite a bit lower than most of their cohorts. And so maybe it is in the next round, being able to help them through that process better.
The board had a lot of concerns about the program itself as a new program as well. And so one of the things the board is always contemplating is, what have we funded in the past? What is our commitment to that past funding? Now, you should know that we always say there's no guarantee whether you've received it in the past or not. It does not mean that you will receive funding in the future. But certainly the board contemplates that as a contextual point. So they had just a lot of questions in general. And so to Lonnie's point, they wanted to see the program run for a little bit longer and then come back and apply.
Does the program exist at all right now, the Goodwill Bike program?
No, it's in its infancy is how they framed it.
Yeah.
It's an idea.
Yeah.
And so that was, I think, a lot of the board trepidation about it is.
Maybe we could see this money as seed money for a program like this. I realize that it scored low, but that's just our way of prioritizing a very small pot of money, right? So, I mean, if we decide otherwise, obviously we can make that choice here.
I would just add, Councilmember Kitchen, that when you look on the far right column, this is also up on the screen, that the objective that the Bicycle Collective has is actually homeless services. It's not the transportation. And so that speaks to how sometimes the objectives in the plan are not exactly up to date with the city's current objectives, especially when we're in the 4th year of a 5-year plan.
Go ahead.
Can I ask you about number 21, Wasatch Homeless Healthcare? So this is something, you said that just because something's been funded in the past doesn't mean that it's going to be funded in the future. Can you tell me why? Because this is the 4th Street Clinic, right?
It is, yes.
Okay. So can you tell me why they scored lower than some of their cohorts, and And why the big shift on that?
I can speak
Lonnie would be
to
happy
it. We have had some limitations on reporting and timeliness of spending.
Okay.
I know that during the public hearing in front of council, that the staff member that did speak to it said that they have had troubles with staffing, and that they just have not been as compliant in the grant application or grant administration and reporting as they need to be.
I would also say that there's no doubt that what 4th Street Clinic does is a critical need for our community. And within that context, I know that the mayor, when we reviewed the recommendations with her, asked that it be reconsidered during the budget time as an offline item, because the other component of this application in particular was maybe federal funding isn't the best source of funding for this group based on sort of the capacity. So it's certainly a priority sort of organization in terms of homeless services. And so we have put that on the list of things to be considered in the upcoming budget as well. And we've done that, as you know, council, that have been here in prior years, we've done that with a few organizations.
And that takes us beautifully into the third policy question here.
You read my mind.
I know. Your writing follows my train of thought usually anyway, Ben, so.
Excellent.
Yeah, please go to number 3.
This is, as a reminder, last year the administration created a consolidated line item, which is up on the screen here. And this is a way for the city to reflect the total investment in homeless service providers. And the policy question has 2 points. The first is if CDBG and the other HUD federal grants, if the awards should be added into this consolidated line item so that they're reflected in one spot, the city's total investment to the homeless service providers. But it also is part 2, if some of these applications would be better funded out of the general fund and not subject to the competitive process of CDBG every year.
And the Goodwill Bikes program also is up for contemplation as part of the homeless services budget as well.
Anything, folks?
In terms of sorry to pull you back to 4th Street Clinic, but what are what kind of risks are we looking at in terms of not funding this program, even if it does get picked up later in the budget?
As far as their unique services that they provide, it's a sticky question.
Okay.
Do you have any answer at all?
Yeah.
As far as if we were to not fund it, is that, I'm sorry if I'm not hearing
Yeah,
correctly.
What kind of, it looks like the request is for $39,600. Do you have any more insight on what exactly, where that cut is going to come or what that's going to look like for the organization?
Lonnie will pull that information from the application in terms of, what percentage of their budget. We know that most of these funds go to salaries and operations, and that's really critical because private donors generally want to give to programs directly. So she will ponder that and kind of look up that information, and we could probably circle back on that if that's appropriate, Councilmember Wharton.
I was just going to look and see what other specific populations and groups they were anticipating serving, and then other funding sources. And I'm sorry, I have a very tabbed, very nice notebook here, but it's Jen's notebook, so I'm still learning.
Okay.
I mean, if Jen was here, she would be able to tell you that
One moment.
in one
Yes.
moment, but we are
And-
filling in for her because she's having some personal obligations. So we're happy to do that, but we're not as good as she is.
And we will be back on this next
Yes.
week.
Oh,
On
yes.
the 10th, we're going to have our other work session on this. So-
So
2
maybe,
weeks.
So maybe we could circle
Actually,
back
we
then.
we moved things around. I think there was some need that it would help hand if we didn't wait till May to decide on CDBG. So we'll be voting on it on the 17th, and we have space on our work session next week. So we'll do our second CDBG next week on this.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
If that's a surprise to you, I'm sorry, there you go.
A good surprise.
I think that takes us to the fourth policy question. This is a follow-up from last year. The council expressed interest in Hand's Neighborhood Building Improvement Program. This is number 5 in the neighborhood improvement section of CDBG. And this is also sometimes colloquially known as kind of the business facade program, where they redo the facades of businesses. And it's gotten a lot of positive feedback. And last year, the council talked about expanding this to other areas of the city, not just the Poplar Grove and Central City target areas. And one possibility in the policy question is if the RDA board wanted to have a discussion about potentially expanding this to upcoming project areas of State Street and 9 Line, or potentially other project areas.
Just as a point of clarification, HUD dollars, the real true requirement is that it's in a CDBG eligible area, which many of the project areas are. So it's not exclusive. It doesn't mean we can't do that, but just to give some parameter, because it's really meant to target those areas. I think what we've enjoyed about this program in particular is that now when you drive through those areas, you start to see an effect of many businesses being improved, and that's been really, really powerful.
And just to illustrate how much of the city is technically eligible for these CDBG dollars, everything in blue on the map up on the screen is eligible, and then the orange is the targeted areas currently under the 5-year plan. So quite a bit of the city.
Just to remind me, that's $25,000 per applicant, is that right?
I don't know.
Is that right? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I would love to talk about this in RDA context.
Me too.
Maybe we can do a matching program or something like that.
Good, that's a good idea. As Mr. Chair of the RDA, will you bring this item back for us when you have time on your agenda?
For sure.
Okay. And John, you can be excused to the back row again if you'd like to not stay with us. Thank you for jumping up on a whim. We appreciate you.
Madam Chair, may I ask a clarifying question?
Please.
On the map, help me understand how it covers most of the city.
The blue areas?
Yeah.
Yeah, why is my neighborhood
So
in
it's,
there?
I should clarify, it covers most of the residential areas of the city, not the total square footage of the city.
What other qualifiers make them qualify?
It's primarily based on per capita income levels. And so what that looks at, and so if you don't have a lot of residential population, then it skews the concentration of lower income levels. And so that's primarily the factor that drives CDBG eligible areas.
That kind of stinks.
Quick question. Does this is this the same map that we're using to look at qualifying census tracts for the opportunity zones?
So we've worked with Roberta and Economic Development, and there's the overlay is there, right? So we wanted it to be an RDA project area and a CDBG eligible area because we believe that the combination of resources will make a more productive environment for investment.
So my question is, if you look at the data that the governor will measure for choosing the qualified opportunity zones, is he pulling from the same data that we're looking at here? Because it covers most of the city as well. I don't know the exact map, but I'm wondering if it's
Very
the same
similar.
data point.
I think there might be some outliers depending on some contiguous rules, but very, very similar.
So can I reiterate this and see if I'm understanding it correctly? That the blue areas are those, or rather, if you have larger lot sizes, so you have fewer people per census tract area, you could have higher incomes because overall there's fewer people in the, but if you have a densely populated area with lower incomes, they could be equally qualified for CDBG dollars. Well, that just stinks.
The other thing I would say is that programs themselves, we really rely on this when we're talking about infrastructure projects and facades. But really, if a program serves low-income people in Salt Lake City, it doesn't matter where they live. So a lot of the programmatic services are not tied to...
They're not resident location
Right.
based.
Yes.
Okay. Andrew?
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're not, if we look at policy changes, we're not going to dilute this down so much that it doesn't benefit the areas that need it the most. So be very judicious in how we're applying it across the city if we're going to expand it outside the target zones.
So that is back to our policy question. Actually, really for getting on to number 5.
So the next 3 policy questions are somewhat related. Number 5 is amending the current 5-year plan, and this was briefly talked about last year, especially in context of the Rape Recovery Center, where they didn't quite fit into one of the objectives of the plan, but they were recognized as kind of a critical provider of services where there was no one else providing it. And what the council wound up doing is removing it from CDBG. You won't see them applying this year, and they're now a line item under civic support in the annual budget under non-departmental. And this policy question is in here because it seems like every year there tends to be one or several areas that are not currently reflected in the objectives. And there is a process to amend the plan, but since we're getting close to the end of the current 5-year plan, that leads us into number 7, which is creating the next 5-year plan.
I'm happy to provide some context if that's helpful for this conversation.
Yes, and if you can include our considerations around host communities for our homeless resource centers.
Yeah. So it would take basically a year to amend an existing plan. So we would be finishing the plan at the same time we amended the plan, if that makes sense, in this last year. So you'd want to take that into consideration if you felt passionately about amending the service population for this year. As we begin, and we will be beginning this summer on the consolidated plan, we definitely want to take into consideration the new resource shelters and the needs of the community. This is a very long, it's really about 18 to 24 months of an outreach process with the communities to help identify new needs. I think that there's a lot of learnings from this last 5-year plan that will be applied. And some of that might relate around how do we make sure that the plan is a little more flexible so that we can respond to the emerging needs, et cetera. What I don't think will change is that there will always be more needs than there is funding. And so that's always going to be the framework in which we work.
Council members, any thoughts? Yeah, please go ahead, Councilmember Fowler.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I don't know where to begin and if this is the right spot to, so I'm just going to jump in and start talking, and you can feel free to stop me at any point when I start rambling. But so first off, since I wasn't here 4 years ago to create the consolidated plan, I'm assuming, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that the council at that time came up with these plan objectives and then came up with sort of the sub-objectives of each main objective? Or how did those objectives come about? Maybe that's the better question to ask.
The council is a main stakeholder, but the primary needs and objectives are driven from the community. So we go out and we kind of, and let me just back up and say, we don't get to go out to the community and say, whatever it is you want, we can put that in the plan. We kind of start with the framework of what's allowable under each entity, right? So CDBG is very specific, home, HAPA, ESG. And then we kind of start to engage with the community on the qualified needs and get a sense for where they stand. Now, I wasn't here either during that 2-year outreach, but I think we're much better at outreach than we used to be. And then the council and the mayor are key stakeholders in this process in terms of needs. So it's not as though we then present to you something that we've vetted and taken to 100% before there's an opportunity. There's ample opportunity to influence and to make sure that what you see in your community is being reflected and considered. Does that answer or help answer your question? Okay.
And I appreciate that. I do have a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know where I'm looking at my notes that I took the other day when we met separately, and about all of these grants. And I keep coming back to this thing that popped out at me when we met separately, and it is starred in my notebook about home ownership grants, and that we were very low on sort of reaching the needs of actually providing home ownership. And I kind of, as I look at what the housing objectives are, certainly those are important objectives, but how do we I'm wondering if there's a way to also begin addressing actually getting people into buying homes and what that kind of looks like. And maybe that's something that as we do community outreach, that's kind of what we're looking at. Again, I don't know where this falls in. It just is a continuous thing in my head of how do we get people actually buying homes here of some sort.
Yeah, Councilmember Fowler, I mean, you've pointed on probably the only one of our 5 objectives that we're concerned about meeting at the end of the 5-year consolidated plan. And that's not for lack of people providing the service, right? It's a very difficult market. The issue, to be not too jargony, hopefully, is that HUD only allows a certain amount to be spent on a home. That amount is less than what homes are going for today. So if HUD says, well, you can loan up to $250,000 on a home, we can't find a home at $250,000. So what that suggests is that we would need additional dollars to come in and help subsidize so that we could meet both the federal regulations and input other items. So as we think about, I know as public outreach is being done around sort of the sales tax and bond, just to put this into perspective, those dollars are not just for rental, they're also to help leverage some of these federal dollars towards home ownership. I think in my world, in Melissa's world that I live in, which is sometimes not the world anybody else lives in, is we would function in an environment when the market begins to soften and go down. We're in a position with the Community Land Trust to really invest in home ownership. And I think that's a really strategic and tactical place to be in, that when homes are not going for what they are today, that the city can step in and make sure that it continues to be affordable.
And
Probably didn't answer your question exactly, but you are right on all of your comments.
And we'll be able to dig a little bit deeper into this in our funding our future agenda item today and ongoing. But there's a little bit more detail that wasn't in our packet that I think we have or it may now be in our packet, that we'll get to hear from. I think we'll hear from you again today, or we'll have the chance to if we want to ask. Anybody else?
I think it's a good point, though, that this is HUD money, and so it comes with certain HUD restrictions. It's not open-ended, so it's important to remember that as we're looking at who we're funding, how we're funding, and our objectives, because it's not. It comes with a lot of strings, and you have to work with what they give you, right? We're thankful for it. We're grateful for the opportunity to do good with it, and acknowledge the limitations that this particular stream has on it. So the more we can leverage it with other things we're doing and other policies we do. If we talk about housing, there should be much larger levers that we should be pulling for housing across the city, and this could augment a smaller piece of it once we do that. So,
In a changed market, you mean, or today's market?
I'd say even in current market, but yeah, definitely in a change market. If we're going to affect housing, there are large things we probably ought to be looking at. And this is a small piece of that.
So I think that takes us to the 6th policy question, which is about progress under the current 5-year plan. And it's a question about how do we determine if we're being successful in our current 5-year plan, if there are elements of the 5-year plan that we definitely want to continue into the next 5-year plan, if there are some challenges that we might want to tweak in the next 5-year plan to better address. And one of the things you might have noticed in the funding log this year is the project description now lists a number of estimated beneficiaries. And to council staff, that seemed like a really good metric to start measuring, how are we doing with progress under our current plan, because beneficiaries are a nice even way that are consistent year to year. You can count and you can compare.
Let's go on to item 7 unless anyone wants to discuss this. Okay.
Item 7 is creating the 2020 to 2024 consolidated plan. As Melissa said, it's an 18-month plus process. And one of the things I've learned since the staff report was published is the administration items that receive funding under each of the grants will help fund some of the outreach efforts. But if I had known that, I would have asked if there was also potentially a funding need for enhanced outreach to create the next plan, or if that would be sufficient funding to do the 18+ month process. And then you'll also see there are several questions, A through E, just as brainstorms to help the council think about, what would this process to create the next plan look like? What should it look like?
Yeah, Melissa, can you talk to that question around the outreach needs for the upcoming consolidated plan?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to give any sort of fiscal number now. I think we're in the process of really determining what is going to be needed to do effective outreach. We have traditionally hired consultants, and we usually hire two. One local that really does sort of what we call intercept outreach, right? They go to where people are. They're not hosting big tent events or something where we expect people to come at 6 o'clock and have no food and no childcare, and who can do that, right? So we would intend to do that again, and that's sort of the minimum. And then internally, we are needing to put together sort of outreach notices and marketing plans and all of that. So that will come, but we haven't got the final number on it yet.
And might we expect to see that request through our normal budget process and not through CDBG?
Right.
Okay. And I want to address item C under 7. What elements of the current plan might you say were really successful or that should be changed?
I think this is a really difficult question and something we've been contemplating internally as we look forward, because it's such an opportunity to really start again with the community and to re-identify the needs. And I would say that one thing that we are really contemplating is the impact of infrastructure and versus sort of building. And what I mean by that is, in some places, CDBG dollars or federal funds are used in a more strategic manner for community spaces. So buildings that have a head start, or some of those. And we used to do investments like that, and we moved away from it. And so the question is coming up in terms of how we really, and this gets back to areas of opportunity, which we have spoken about for years, in terms of you shouldn't have to leave your community to get access to resources. So is there a way that federal funds can be used to create opportunity in areas that need it? Low-cost grocery stores, or childcare, or community centers, or libraries. And so that's something we are contemplating. I'm hesitant to say too much, but I don't think that we are going to look at this plan and say, everything we did is still relevant. One of our things that we're very happy about is that a lot of the ADA sidewalks and accessibility was really completed under this 5-year plan. There will always be some ongoing need, and we need to stick to that. But the fact that we were able to complete a lot of that infrastructure in these designated areas is a pretty big deal. But it's also a sign that we probably don't need to emphasize that going forward. So it's a blank canvas, and we look forward to
wedge in there to reiterate this back to the host HRC communities, that my understanding is that in this early analysis of what's been done around, say, a 1/4-mile radius around the 2 sites, that the 700 South site needs 0 ADA ramps. It's fully curb cut and awesome, which is in black and white contrast, basically, to the High Avenue, Paramount Avenue site, which has gaps in sidewalk coverage and in the hundreds of ADA ramp needs. So how we draw the boundaries of our next opportunity areas is of great concern to me, because we absolutely haven't addressed the ADA ramps in what is about to become one of our most critical areas in the city, which is also the second highest tax generating area of the city, where we continue to not invest in infrastructure, which is 300 West. So I totally agree, Melissa, that this is an incredible opportunity with our new consolidated plan and all the changes that have happened in the last 4 going on 5 years. The way we'll shape this new plan is of great importance to, I think, this entire body. I know that we're a stakeholder in your process, but we're also the ultimate decision makers in the funding. So if you can give us any insight into how really we'll be able to be involved in the crafting of this plan, that would be great.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to prioritize on our end to make sure we have time to sit down with you early and throughout the process. So we'll
Thank
get
you.
back and we'll get with council staff to get some things on the calendar.
Thank you.
Bet.
Anything else, council members or Ben, that we've left out? Are you satisfied?
Very.
Okay. All right. So we have a few follow-ups, and I did a poor job of taking notes from the beginning, but Councilmember Wharton wanted some feedback on what the cut from Wasatch or 4th Street Clinic would mean for their programming. Was there anything else that you needed on that one?
No, not that.
Okay. Concern from Councilmember Fowler that I think we share around how do we increase access to home ownership through this fund and others. And I think that'll be a multifaceted ongoing discussion. And the inclusion of the HRC host communities as a critical component for me, and I imagine Councilmember Kitchen as well, if not the whole body, in this upcoming consolidated plan. And it's good to know that there's no real point in us amending the existing one when that would be a
lot of effort.
A lot of effort for the same timing as our new plan to come out, right? Did I miss anything, council members, for a follow-up item? Okay. Thank you for being with us. And we'll see you again next week.
Great. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, it's such a easier process now. I think every year I say this, but thank you so much.
It's Ben and Jen.
Thank you,
Jen Schuman, too.
Ben and Jen.
Thank you.
Oh, there, Jen. Well, I was thinking we'd go to the bike licensing ordinance, but Councilmember Luke isn't quite here yet. So we'll go to surplus land if we have folks in the room. That's item 5, surplus land disposition policy, prioritizing affordable housing. Melissa and Nick Tarbett coming up. Melissa Jensen, are you flying solo from hand today?
Absolutely not.
We just surprised it. Is Lily coming down?
I'm absolutely not flying solo, but I am kicking us off, and I'm sure my team is feverishly on their way.
We apologize to your team for bumping your spot on the schedule up by 20 minutes. And
That's just fine.
we could do y'all want to take a little break? Okay.
Sure.
We're going to take a 10-minute break, and we will reconvene at 3:35.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Get a break too.
And welcome the more complete staff of hand, Sean, Lily, Melissa, and our own wonderful Nick Tarbett. Thank you for joining us for the surplus land disposition policy, prioritizing affordable housing. Nick Tarbett, you want to begin?
It's probably best we'll just let Lily or whomever, Sean or Melissa, take it from here.
Somebody will
Whoever's-
kick it off.
I'm here. I just want to make sure the council noted there was a few questions that we had raised in the staff memo. At the time the staff report was published, Hand was not able to get us the answers then. They since got them to us. We emailed them to you. So if you do have any questions on that, they are available to talk about them.
Could we ask staff to print that email and bring it by to us real quick while we have the discussion?
Sure, and we'll go ahead and kick it off. So I am really pleased to be here. Housing implementation has begun, and we are working feverishly to get this 5-year plan moving. It was a big impetus that we did a 5-year plan because we wanted it to be actionable and relevant. And so what you have before you today is definitely a first step. Just a note in process. What we have tried to do in this first year is really focus internally on what was possible. What does the city have control of? As it is outlined in the housing plan that we could really take on and begin to move forward. So this is a first of, I would say, 4 to 6 transmittals that you'll see related to affordable housing. Part of the process is making sure that we engage with stakeholders internally as it applies and then externally as it applies. And so that takes time and energy, but I think overall produces a better understanding of what we're asking the council to consider. So today, you have before you the surplus land disposition ordinance and the changes therein. Sean will go ahead and review some of the changes, but what I would say is that we really believe that these ordinance changes produce a framework under which we can begin to really make a difference in how land is considered surplus and also how we can use it to better leverage affordability. So with that, I will just turn it over to Sean.
Thanks, Melissa. All these changes take place in Ordinance 2.58, and it's really 3 primary changes. The first is to define the process for identifying what surplus land is and calculating whether or not that's suitable for affordable housing. This effectively sets the mandate. This sets precedent in our ordinance so that the administration can go through a process of making that evaluation, identifying either department heads or their designees within divisions to go through a systematic process to say these different parcels are or are not suitable for affordable housing development. The next piece, also in 2.58, is stating that affordable housing does not outweigh all other matters. That highest and best use is the first thing to consider. Also making some changes regarding open space and public safety infrastructure to that, but to say that affordable housing isn't going to trump all of the other uses that the city needs to be considering. And then also making a statement about the disposition proceeds going to fund the Housing Trust Fund. Those changes in the ordinance then signal to the market that we're taking this seriously, that our partners know, that the development community knows that this is something to expect, that on parcels that are going to be suitable for housing development, there should be an expectation that affordable housing will be included in that. And then that sets, additionally, the passing the ordinance sets the expectation on the administration to come up with a robust process for what this evaluation looks like. That's broadly the 3 changes that we're looking at.
And Sean, on the this process in a general way of speaking, is it similar to the one that I can't quote the numbers for, but the federal process where the federal properties up for disposition must be first assessed for use as homeless resource centers or homeless shelters? Are you familiar with that policy? that there is a federal policy around disposition of federal properties, and it may be only specific departments in the federal government around disposition of properties, that they must be assessed for use for homeless services before they can be disposed. And this was brought up to us after our HRCs or their site selection process was complete. And NLC did a subsequent training, an online webinar training for council members all over the country in the last year about it. And I see hands looking perplexed at me.
I'm not familiar with the policy.
It's a policy that the GSA,
Okay.
has to, it's in their, basically their disposal process where they have steps that they have to go through, and one of their first steps is assessing for homelessness, and I think there was affordable housing as maybe a part of that.
Yeah.
But,
I don't clearly recall.
so, anyway.
So that one's news to us, but thank you for the reference. I would say that this ordinance is modeled after a process that many other cities go through, who have all identified the need to prioritize affordable housing development on their own properties. So in that sense, it certainly fits within best practices nationally.
And it also builds on existing language that was in the ordinance. There was already pretty clear language around the importance of needs of the city to be considered in this process, and so we really just strengthened some of the existing language there.
Continue on if there's more.
I think that
Councilmember Fowler, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think we wanted to allow time for questions, and so we just wanted to do a high-level overview, so we're happy to take those now.
May I?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So in the .010, which is sort of obviously the very beginning, kind of outlining the process, I was reading through this and kind of through the transmittal as well. Can you walk me through the pros and cons of actually designating a time frame instead of just saying periodically? Because that concerns me, whereas I was thinking, should we not have an inventory every 3 years or whatever that may look like? But perhaps you could walk me through sort of the pros and cons of not adding a time frame there, or, yeah.
It's a great question. It's something we talked about a lot. And we suggested that in the policy and procedure change to provide a target of how often the department heads would identify surplus property. In consultation with the chief procurement officer, the goal would be for an annual identification should resources be available. And part of the reason why we didn't want to codify that is because there certainly was a time during the recession where resources were not available to do an annual process. So that was intentional because we can't predict the capacity, but it would be a goal that it would be annual.
Can we, sorry, as a follow-up, it seems to me in the things that I've learned about all of these different processes is that we may say something that, every 5 years we do this, but as a city council or as a department, we make sure we try to do it every year. For example, you guys weren't in here, but when we were talking with public utilities, that, it's mandated every 5 years, but we look at it every year. My concern in not defining periodically is that that could be 10 years, and then you're coming back, that's periodically, right? and then you're coming back, perhaps sitting on surplus land that we could have invested or divested rather, and received some sort of money, right? Like, we're not looking at where the market is if we're not doing it more periodically. And my concern is that if it's not codified, then that somebody goes 10 years or 15 years or whatever it is, and we've lost out on that investment of land because we don't know it exists. But I certainly recognize the resources. So with that, could we not also say, every 3 years if resources allow. And then, of course, you can always, throughout the process and procedure that's being implemented, say, but our goal is once a year. It just seems to, if we're going to clarify this, and this may be the lawyer hat in me that says, then we should clarify it and each of these different aspects.
I think it's a great point, Councilmember Fowler, and certainly something that we would look for direction from this body to do.
I mean, I have more, I can keep going, but I'll let somebody else talk.
Did you want to give that specific direction right now?
Oh, I don't know.
You can come back. Okay. Do you want to continue?
We don't have anything else. We're just open for questions, and we want to be able to be responsive to any concerns or input that you may have.
Thank you. It was a great set of questions. We appreciate that you got the answers to us. I don't know if everyone's had the chance. We just got these in our hands to look through the answers. Councilmember Fowler?
I'm sorry, this is really interesting to me, and so I have some other things before coming back to that
Sure.
first point, but I don't, again, want to monopolize anybody's
Doesn't look
time.
like anyone else is jumping at this.
So, in the transmittal, under sort of bold 3 and then number 3, and I have to go back to that myself because I was writing this, but I had a concern there in that,
Page 8 of 23.
yes. Sorry, I'm gathering. I'm wondering, and I guess this isn't within the language of the ordinance, but maybe something to think about, that as it says, you know, we evaluate land to see if it's suitable for these things. I'm wondering if we should sort of also put language that says, if it's not suitable for this, then here's what else we would want to do with it. Here are the other priorities for it.
And I think that is described in 2.58, and that is the highest and best use disposition of the parcel.
Okay. And then, so far, that's everything.
Okay.
I think. I might come back to it.
Anything else, Councilmembers? Councilmember Johnston?
I have no problem with this current language and maybe a clarification on the time frame with the contingency based on resources available, because we keep stretching our departments farther than they're meant to be stretched. My bigger sort of picture piece of this is about real property the city owns, and are we evaluating current market needs for it? Are we evaluating the current value and evaluating our use of our property? And this is about surplus property, and we define surplus property as property we're not using or we wouldn't use for various reasons. But a broader analysis of all city-owned properties of real ownership, that's where our value is. That's where our wealth of the city is. And I'm very interested in pursuing an analysis of that and figuring out, are there ways that we could harness that more effectively?
Just to clarify, you're speaking things that we're not using, but also things that we are actively using.
Yeah, and this would be a much bigger discussion than just today. I bring it up now because it's part of our land use stuff. And this is much higher than anything we're talking about today.
I think there is lots of best practices, and Jen Bruno shared an article directly related to this. And I think, yes, that's a great question to be asking. It's just a matter of bringing in a consultant to help us do that work, whether that was just for surplus or overall land. Because it's certainly a valuable undertaking, but also would require some cost adjustment.
Yeah, and I agree. This would not be a short-term project. This would be something long-term that, I say this is one of those big levers in my head, in that it would take a number of years. It would take outside consulting and some investment of money. But our assets as a city lie in land and people, but land. And we don't really have a good understanding of all of it. And with some evaluation over a period of time, we may come up with some longer-term ways to maximize the value for housing, for economic development, for other things. But it would take an investment on our part. So I'm interested in pursuing that.
Yeah, jump in.
Andrew, do you mean like an inventory of all of the land that we own and sort of start to evaluate that, or start some procedure to evaluate that?
Yeah, that'd be the first step. The first step is just figuring out what we own, right?
Right.
Well, and if I can jump in, page 9 of 23 under 4 says that hand staff found 128 properties, and it gives details about that being 67 acres that could accommodate 1,200 units. So I think it's bizarre that we don't have that list as part of this presentation today. But
Just to clarify, that was not the full list of city inventory. We were just kind of drilling down of here's parcels that are likely to, or could fall in that category of suitable for affordable housing development, to give a sense of the scale. But that is no means indicative of the full inventory.
No, our full inventory includes public services, and they're doing their own analysis. And it would take a lot of work across this is a big undertaking just to get an inventory. And then figure out what is the market value of it. And then figure out, do you want to pursue even another way to manage it that would be external to us? Those kind of concepts. So you can see how this builds, but the first steps are inventory of our current assets.
And it sounds like they're farther along that path than we are seeing today. I know Amy's not done. I know Councilmember Luke and Councilmember Kitchen want to jump in, so go Amy, Charlie, and then Derek.
And I have more comments, but this is in relation to this. How do we define surplus?
So that is proposed to be part of the policy. So we had a pretty robust conversation with folks impacted by the ordinance, and Chief Procurement Officer, who's very involved in this process. And the group's opinion was that that definition to guide department heads should be in a policy, because it is something that could potentially evolve over time, and that is an easier means of having something that could change as our definition of surplus evolves to match current needs. That is certainly something that is open to discussion, but that was the recommendation that the group had.
Charlie.
Yeah, it's mostly related to the housing inventory. So I just want to echo your comments, Madam Chair, that I do think that it would be very helpful to have that list. I know that Public Services is working on it right now, but I think that it's important that we get that as soon as we possibly can, so that we can start making informed decisions when talking about affordable housing. Because in every city where a municipality is able to successfully work on affordable housing options, it's using city-owned land, and that's where they're able to make the biggest difference. And so I think without having that information, we can talk about housing options all we want, but that is going to be, we're missing a major point without having that information. So I think the sooner we can get that, the better. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get down on the agenda, talking about the sales tax increase.
Great. Councilmember Kitchen.
Building on what Councilmember Johnson was talking about, I would really like to see what you've already got on hand. Because I think you and we've talked about this a little bit, but I would love to see more of a balance sheet style of our city's real estate holdings, and compare not only market value, but how it stacks up against book value as well in the community, and figure out how we may prioritize either the sale or the disposition of that property, or maybe the long-term holding. You know, this community is growing incredibly fast, and real estate prices are only going to continue to rise. And so I wonder if it might be worthwhile for us to look at maybe retaining ownership of some of these properties in, say, the community land trust or some other mechanism that would allow us to leverage it for a longer period of time. Because once you sell a piece of property, the likelihood of you getting it back is nigh. So just whatever you have, if you could send that our way, I would really appreciate some insight as well.
So we will make that a follow-up for my team to get that, what I would call the developable land list. As you know, we have like over 1,500 parcels. Some of them are this big. I don't think that that's what this body is asking for today. That would probably take a lot more time to get. However, we do have a preliminary list. I think what would be helpful in terms of direction is happy to give the list with zoning. We would pull the assessed value most likely from the county as the main number. If we wanted any sort of other appraisal done, that would probably significantly add time to this information getting to you. So I'm open to kind of making sure that as we present it, I would like to present it in a way that makes sense from our perspective as an administration, the possibility as well, so that as you contemplate, you have the information you need.
And Jennifer Bruno?
I think that the city's financial system actually keeps track of just from public assets, because we have assets and liabilities. We do have a balance sheet that has all the city's assets. We don't have it maybe cross-referenced with what properties might be developable or not. And so maybe if you guys could get together with the finance department, you can put together those two sets of information and maybe make it a little user-friendly and that kind of thing.
That is, as we were speaking, Dan Ripp couldn't be here today, our real property manager, but as we were speaking this morning, one of the things he said is there's a huge caveat in that this data needs to be scrubbed and reconciled with one solution. So I'm happy we'll work with finance, but I'm not sure the timing on it. I'm hesitant to commit to timing.
Okay, council members, is there anything else? Yeah, Amy, come on back.
Okay, I have I'm jumping. I have three major things, and we've talked about the first two. So the third one goes to the disposition of proceeds, 0.060. And I mean, I am very supportive of putting a percentage or some sort of amount into the housing trust fund or a housing trust fund. Again, lawyer hat on, I get concerned, and I'm wondering if there is a way to kind of define that a little better, in the sense that something I wrote down just as I was thinking about this was sort of, if the proceeds exceed X, then X percent goes into the housing trust fund, or something along those lines. I mean, that might be a little too layman term simple, but I also, in taking these notes, said this sort of makes it less dependent on whoever is in office or whoever is in the position of being the director of the neighborhood development department. I can't remember the title there, but, and if we could, instead of just a portion goes in, if we would, again, kind of walk me through the pros and cons of not defining that a little bit better.
Yeah, I think the pro was to create flexibility. The proceeds that are going to be coming into the surplus land account and the balance of the housing trust fund are both things that are going to be in flux and evolve over time. And so that led to some wariness to set something in stone in the ordinance, but rather have it be part of an annual recommendation, which is codified in here, that there would be an annual recommendation, but that was something that could evolve and would go to City Council for review and approval. I think if there are opinions on having more specificity here, that is certainly something that we would love to get your input on. But that was the rationale that went behind this language.
I think, to your point, another thing to contemplate is that the surplus land account balance varies greatly. So if we were to look at it, let's say in April, maybe it's 8 million. Then you look at it in the fall and maybe it's 2 million because needs have fluctuated. So I think there's sort of a policy question that I'm not sure how to articulate, but that's there around timing that maybe you might have thoughts on as well. I'm not being solution focused here. I'm not being helpful in that, but I do kind of see a timing constraint because this account has traditionally been used for just strategic acquisitions, or we've come through budget amendment. It always comes to council, and then if we sell a piece of land, then obviously, if it's 10 million, from my perspective, that's the time to move it to housing trust fund, right, when it's at its peak. But from a policy perspective, I don't know if that's really the way that you if we want to say at least in the fall, or some sort of timing around the contemplation of this fund so that it happens on an annual basis, as opposed to saying, oh, it needs to be 10% or it needs to be this. What's really important to, I would say, the internal departments is that this is considered in the context of all the city needs, right? We are putting on a lens of affordable housing, but certainly that's not the only need of this city. And so we wanted to provide, to Lily's point, the flexibility for this body to contemplate that.
I would only add to your second out of the 3 points, Councilmember Fowler, about the flexibility, is that when thinking about any of the flexibility that is or is not outlined in the ordinance, the justifications and the definitions and the explanation will be right there for you at the time that a CAN director makes a recommendation. So if, for instance, the definition of how divisions have been selecting surplus land isn't quite what you're looking for, if there needs to be some other consideration, that can easily be adjusted there without necessarily having to open up the ordinance to do so.
I agree. I really think that this particular council is awesome and I love them all. And these things worry me for the future of when I'm not here, mostly. Just kidding. Though I'm more in hatching this, so. No, but, so I understand that. I do just kind of in that like 10-year, 15-year down the road, you could certainly bring that back as an amendment to the ordinance, right? If it did need to change based on evolution. That said, I certainly understand the concerns as well, which is why I kind of couched it in that I need to walk through the pros and cons of this to keep thinking about it. And I appreciate also the timing issue. Again, going to kind of my point of like at least having a percentage, like some percent, is that you're continuing that addition to the Housing Trust Fund. But again, understanding what the cons there could be, because if it's 10% and really we wanted to put 50% in there, are we then locked out of doing something like that or vice versa? So, I mean, again, that's sort of more of why I was just asking for all of the input that you just gave me, and I appreciate it.
Practically.
Your last question, okay.
Could I just add one thing?
Yes, but we got to move on. So if you guys need to continue a conversation before we take action on this on the 17th, and if there's changes, we have next week-ish to work through those, and that could come back to us in a written briefing if they're substantial. Okay.
Would it, Madam Chair, would it be possible just to check on the 2 to 3 year time frame that you had asked for? It looked like you were interested in straw poll. Is there appetite for that, or do you want to just hold off for now?
I'm happy to ask for a straw poll or request a straw poll and see where everybody lies on this, of including, I would suggest a 3-year time frame, obviously with a goal being more than that, but a 3-year time frame codified. And then what was the language? Where and when resources are available. Some language along those lines, and wondering.
Will you give us the section?
It's 0.010, so it's the very first of that ordinance. And so if we look at the ordinance, it says,
For
it's not in
reporting
red,
requirements.
but it's the very first line.
I think it would be defining what periodically means as a minimum of once every 3 years, subject to resource availability.
Right. So the department heads or designees shall identify potential surplus real property every 3 years where resources are available. And, I'm sure legal can come up with something better than that, but for
Okay,
straw poll
any
purposes.
discussion on that? I see one.
Sure.
Councilmember Johnston.
Do we want to define what resources are available means?
Yeah, it just seems like it
Pulls us
It's
down a hole, I think.
easy
deeper
way
and
to
deeper.
say
Yeah.
we're busy.
I mean, that's the thing. I get the point, but if we keep leaving back doors because of, I think, well, here's my honest opinion. I think we all know that we're stretched thin. That if we haven't identified for them the priorities, and they have to identify the priorities of how they're going to use their time. And if this is going to be a low priority, it's going to always be a low priority, and it's never going to get done, regardless of what's in the
It's kind of like
code. So
we're walking along as a city and we're picking up pennies and we keep putting pennies in our pocket. And it's like, we don't really know how many pennies are in there, but I don't have time to stop and count them right now. And it could actually be a pretty big piece of value. There's a lot of value in doing this assessment.
Well, and I think that's exactly to my point of adding a timeline, is that it creates it as a priority.
Yes, but we just don't want to put if
I'm
the
fine taking
resources
the
are
resources
available.
out. I was doing that on Andrew's suggestion. So my suggestion is every 3 years, or a time limit. If it's 5 years, if that makes more sense, but to actually define periodically as a time frame wherein this shall be done, such that we can monitor this surplus land and determine. I think this will, in my opinion, go straight to Andrew's comment on taking more of this inventory and understanding the pennies in our pockets and what we have there. So I would
Want to
define
change
it-
your straw poll?
I will change my straw poll to just define it as every 3 years.
So it would read, department heads or designees shall identify potential surplus real property every 3 years within their possession of their departments every 3 years and report such property to the chief procurement officer, and so on.
Is that too soon? Is 5 better?
Oh, don't ask that question.
Okay, 3. Okay, okay.
Our intent is to do annually. It may be at a minimum of every
Okay.
3 years.
Yeah,
That's-
my expectation is that we would still have the policy goal of it being on an annual basis. So
Okay, everybody get the straw poll every 3 years?
are there other resources that are needed? Are there resources that are needed to accomplish this?
I think the first round will require some resources until we know what we have and where we have it and all of that. But then after that, I would have to ask the departments to really know.
Great.
Madam Chair, could we straw poll Amy's as spoken? And if Andrew wants to add that to another one, we can do that.
I just
Okay.
don't like unfunded mandates. I mean, that's my concern. If there's more resources needed, we need to know that, because we're putting another mandate on a department.
Well, it's already in the code that they shall periodically identify potential surplus.
Sure.
And we're just defining periodically. So, all right, call for the vote. All those in favor of Amy's straw poll? We're unanimous with Councilmember Rogers absent. Any other straw polls? Okay. Any other comments, questions on this surplus land disposition policy? I have a comment. I emailed you guys just now or during this discussion. It's Title V of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act.
Yep.
And we are eligible, as are states and housing authorities, to apply for real property, all sorts, even sleeping bags, that is owned by the federal government. So I know it sounds like we have a ton of property of our own, and why would we want to go looking for federal property? But you never know. So put that in our back pocket too. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
We will move on backwards in our agenda to item 2, our bicycle licensing ordinance amendments with Russell Weeks from our council staff and Captain Scott Tierlink from SLCPD. Or not. Or Chief Brown and Deputy Chief Josh Sherman.
We're not Tierlink, right?
Did I get, are you Deputy Chief, right? Okay. I always get those messed up. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you.
You can lower your chair, Chief,
That
if
is
you
kinda
need
high,
to.
isn't
You don't have to. Russell, would you like to give us an intro?
Yes, I mean, the intent of the proposed amendments is to make it easier to register a bicycle in Salt Lake City, and the secondary intent is to make it easier for police to have access to that registration information.
I think Councilmember Luke wants to give us an intro also.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think that was good. But I would go a little bit further. I think the reason that this is, really exciting is because it's really when you look at crimes and issues that the police department has a very difficult time solving, it's bicycle theft. And if any of you have been down to the evidence storage facility, it looks like a bike warehouse down there because there are so many bicycles that are unidentified that the police department just has no ability to trace back. What this does is it eliminates the fee that you pay when you buy a new bike. It puts everything online so that it makes it very easy to register a new bicycle by the serial code or the serial number, and then it allows the police department to utilize that information. So when a bike is recovered, which they oftentimes are, you can actually put it back to the resident who lost it. And it's really the first of its kind in Utah. I know that the system is set up in a way that other cities could and the county could utilize it, which would probably, I think we ought to encourage them to do that. Because the bigger the database, the better. And so this is something that really will allow the police department to do a job that residents expect them to do, but they just have not had the tools to do it in the past. So thank you for your work on this, Chief. And
no, thank you, Councilmember Luke.
Madam Chair.
Thanks for kind of pointing out the problem. I mean, just to set the framework just a little bit, the old system was kind of antiquated and archaic. You would have to drag your bike down to the police station or fire station and then have somebody come out and help you with the registration, fill it out in triplicate, get your little sticker, put it on your bike. This copy was then sent to the county, put into a system that sadly we had no access to. So as we went out looking for stolen bikes or abandoned bikes, we could never find the owner because very few people would follow through with that whole system. So as you mentioned, we've been talking about this for years. We've been working with Mayor Biskupski and her administration because there's just got to be a better way. And so by doing it, we can now, you can do it at a bike shop, you can do it on your smartphone. All you have to do is go to saltlakecitypd.com, click on the bike registration, put in the information, name, address, the serial number. You can even snap a picture of your bike and attach it so that when we find a bike abandoned or a possible stolen bike, we can actually just pull it up and address it right there. I mean, in 2017, we had 1,194 bikes stolen. We had 212 that were found and or abandoned. So 1,406 bicycles ended up stolen or abandoned. Sadly, only 83 of those bikes reported stolen or abandoned were ever brought back to their owners. So that's less than 6%. So it truly has been a problem for us. And I think this would be a huge step forward in technology. And as Salt Lake City pushes to be a more bicycle-friendly city, this would really help in that move. Because you could be riding your bike down the Jordan River Trailway from Sandy. I mean, the ordinance says the bike's got to be registered. You can now do that from home. If you're traveling from out of state, you want to register a bike, you can. It's a very good upgrade to what we're trying to do.
Council members?
One other quick thing. If I just want to thank Detective Josh Smith for the work that he put in on this. There wasn't a community council meeting where he didn't bring this up and wonder where things, how this was progressing and where things were going. I know that he was very instrumental in this, and so I just want to thank him publicly for his work on this.
Thank you.
Okay, council members, any questions?
There was one more thing, if I could
Oh,
add.
of course, go ahead.
There was a question that brought up today with our awesome finance team, that there was a question with the consolidated fee schedule, and there was a question about how many retailers that may affect on that front end. So we want to be able to come back to you with an amended template of exactly how much. We want to make sure that we know what the fiscal note or the lack of revenue will be on that. So there might be an update to that.
Okay. Any other questions or statements? Councilmember Johnston?
All in favor?
All right.
The current system is ridiculous and
Yeah.
useless, so. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's ridiculous to get your bike lessons at this point, so anything would be an upgrade almost, and this sounds like a much, much better upgrade, so thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Councilmember Fowler?
I've been mulling over this for a while, but I appreciate getting rid of the fee for in one aspect. And I was looking at the fiscal note of it, and it's what, less than $3,000 is what I read, roughly.
Well, we estimated that, and it may be around 8 to 9.
Okay.
So it's under 10,000.
Okay. I mean, as a whole now, like $10,000 doesn't seem very much to me, given what we look at. But I was thinking about if we had that, like something earmarked with those license fees to go to like a homeless bike population thing, program of some sort, that if there were a way to still, I'm all in favor of this. And the reason I'm okay with getting rid of the fee is that if we do have somebody who can't, for some reason, afford the fee to register their bike, but then they get it. But then I was thinking of some sort of trying to be creative of how do we then, if we did still have the fee, move it to an actual, like maybe homeless bike program, right? Where that would be there to, even just as little as providing lights. Many of my clients get pulled over on bikes because they don't have lights on them.
Sure.
But that's more maybe of just some other discussion about how we can maybe look at things. And it was $2, and I was like, if you're buying a brand new bike, of course people are going to pay $2 extra to license it, to make sure that they get it back, because it's only $2, right? And I was kind of thinking if there was any sort of creative way that we could use that money for our homeless population that oftentimes are using bikes.
Sure, yeah.
Maybe.
So it looks like we have Mary Beth Thompson here. Do you want to answer that?
So the $2 is actually what retail can charge. What we charge the retailers is $50 for a book of 100 and 100 tags. So we do that in business licensing. It doesn't mean that we could not exclude that off of the CFS, and we could continue to charge for the service that the police department is providing online instead of charging it for the books. The way that the ordinance is written is it's charged for cost of book and tags, right? So you'd have to change the ordinance, tweak the ordinance a little bit, continue to charge that fee on the business license, base that on the service that the police department's providing on the online service instead, and move that funding if you chose to do so. That was a long roundabout way of explaining it, but.
So, Madam Chair, the next time the council could act on an ordinance would be April 17th. That might take a little more time if we're going to amend the ordinance to involve fees, et cetera.
Charlie?
I like the idea. I would rather, though, that we just appropriate the money to do it. I don't know how much that would cost to do. What I like about not charging a fee is I think even if it's 50 cents, if you charge something, some people may avoid doing it. And I know that it's not a financial thing. It's just more of a hassle. So I would prefer that we stick with the ordinance as written, and then when we are putting the budget together, figure out what something like a light program or something could cost. I think we could come up with something like that.
So to note, this fee, you don't have an ordinance for the consolidated fee schedule to remove this $50 fee off the consolidated fee schedule. That was not transmitted with the transmittal. That's going to have to come to you in a different transmittal to remove this fee off the consolidated fee schedule to stop charging businesses for this fee.
And why was that not transmitted at the same time? Do we know?
That was our error.
That was our
error.
We missed that. We'll take that one. The fire department did that one.
We're just cops.
Okay, but can we expect that, or it was transmitted this afternoon? Okay, perfect. So what I think we could do is just, depending on what we pass move this forward, and then as soon as we can get that on the agenda, I know that there's a lot of other stuff
With the
on there,
budget
but
coming up.
with the budget coming up, you know, I think the intent is that we don't charge for this, which is what's going to make the service successful. So the sooner we could get that moving, the better.
And we're just looking for approval at the formal meeting. So if it's the April 17th meeting, that's great.
Yeah.
If it has to happen the 1st of May, we can do that too.
Yeah.
I just thought it was really remarkable that 1,200 bikes were stolen last year in Salt Lake City, and I feel like if we had, if there was a little, a little sign at every bike shop, or at the point where someone's forking over the money for a new bike or getting their bike tuned up or something, and they're at that register and they see register your bike for free and increase your chances of getting your bike back. That is an astonishing number, 1,200 bikes last year.
And that's just reported. I'll bet it's higher than that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Officers talk to them every day, and they talk to you, they see your bike, and they can't get it back.
So I'm grateful for this ordinance. Thanks to Councilmember Luke for bringing it through, and to the police department and our staff for helping make this happen. I just want to see people register their bikes, including me. I have a garage full. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I don't have any bikes. They're definitely not worth anything. Okay, anything else, council members? We'll look to see this then, hopefully on our formal meeting, April 17th, for a vote.
Okay.
Thank you, Chief, Deputy Chief Russell.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. I got to get back on track here. Do y'all mind if we skip our break because we took it earlier? Okay. Then let's go to the state legislative briefing. We're going to have Lynn, there you are, Lynn Pace. Usually it's hard to miss you in the audience with your height and stature, and Mayor Biskupski, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
It looks like David Litvak's going to join us as well.
Sorry. Making sure my phone's on.
And we apologize, and this is really a briefing for the public's sake, especially. I think we all know what happened, but we've had to kick this off our work session agenda the last 2 times we've had it scheduled because we became so busy. So we don't mean to be untimely so far after the session, but this is a great synopsis.
Quite all right. Thank you for having us. We're happy to visit about the prior legislative session. I think in terms of our discussion, it's just a legislative briefing. So what I had intended to do, and I think you've got this information in your packet, that report, that memo, is a report on the specific priority items that we had identified before the session. So I went through our list of priority items and then highlighted all of the legislation that was proposed, what passed and what didn't, relative to those priority items. So I'd be happy to walk through that, but if you've already read all that, then we don't necessarily need to take your time. What I will say is that on those items, there were, I'm trying to think here, run through this quickly. There were 8 priority items, with the exception of the Northwest Quadrant, which I think was, which we've already talked about a great deal. All of the other items had a remarkably successful outcome for Salt Lake City. That's not to say there wasn't a lot of drama along the way, which there was, but I think we can be very pleased and very proud of the results that we were able to accomplish, and we're happy to provide that report. The one item that a couple of items that I would just like quickly to bring to your attention, because the report that I gave you was fairly cryptic on this. If you've got just a minute, I'd like to highlight 2 items on the list. One is the homelessness issues and the 2 bills that were passed there and the funding resources. And I'm going to let David chime in as appropriate here. But what we had initially anticipated, there were 2 bills that were proposed. We had initially anticipated that one of those would pass. Turns out both of them did, which was a very positive result for Salt Lake City and the other cities that host these homeless resource centers. One of them, Representative Elison's bill, created a pool of funds. It ultimately ended up being state funding to provide funding for the operation of the resource centers. So state money for the operator, okay? The second bill, which was Senator Davis's bill, was a bill that was funded with city money. When I say city money, I mean cities generally. And that bill created a funding source to reimburse the host communities for their law enforcement costs. The reason that second bill in particular is significant is because it will provide approximately a $5 million, if I remember that right,
Yep.
$5 million pool, from which the initial impetus for that bill was to provide funding to Midvale and to South Salt Lake, because the legislature was a little bit sensitive that they had forced resource centers on these communities that did not really volunteer for them. But the pool was expanded beyond the amount of funds needed for those two communities to create a resource for other communities, notably Salt Lake City, Ogden, and St. George, who all have facilities, so that we can apply for and receive some mitigation for our costs in that respect. Bear in mind that host cities do not contribute to that fund, but cities that do not host facilities contribute from the population portion of their sales tax. That was a bit dicey among various cities because some were in favor and some were not. But the Speaker of the House was very clear that he was confident that if cities had the choice to contribute or to host a facility, they would all prefer to contribute. And no one really was willing to dispute that premise, and so the bill passed under those terms. But do you have any questions about that, or David, do you want to add anything further?
I think that covered it well.
I have a question. I wonder, and I'm not up on all of the housing legislation that has passed or where that's at, but I wonder in that same vein of communities that have basically outzoned affordable housing.
Have outzoned?
Have unzoned it, that there's no zoning that will allow affordable housing to happen.
Yeah, there are, that has come up in a couple of different ways, and there's a paragraph in the report about affordable housing which took some small steps to address that. But there are two things that came up in this dialogue, because initially the funding source that Representative Elison passed, initially that was proposed to be allocated based upon, the costs assessed based upon the amount of affordable housing you had in each community. There were two responses to that. One was that cities, while they had some influence on that, couldn't create that housing. They could authorize it, but they can't create it. There were other communities who were concerned that even if they approved more density, that none of it would be affordable. It would all be market rate housing, and that dialogue played itself out. But there's no question that there is certainly was a heightened sensitivity at the legislature that the model we have created, which is smaller communities with lots of local control, does not lend itself to regional development, and it tends to be a little bit more protectionist. And so we saw that come up in the RDA context, in the homelessness context, in the affordable housing context. I suspect we have not heard the last of that. And what we have seen is the state stepping in some ways that might be helpful to us, in other ways, like in the Northwest Quadrant, in ways that were not helpful to us, where the state feels that they know best, and that someone at that level needs to exercise some leadership to pursue these policy agendas, whether it's economic development or affordable housing or otherwise. I don't know if that answered your question.
My understanding is that it's in the state constitution that cities must not make it impossible to build affordable housing, and yet there is little to no enforcement on cities that have eliminated that zoning option, or from a multifamily perspective, or have made it impossible to do affordable housing in cities.
Yeah, I have not done the research to know where that is. I know that there is talk that there are cities who, are not in favor of multifamily housing or that sort of thing. In terms of affordable housing, bear in mind that there are different sort of terms of art. There's 30%, 50%, 80% of AMI. All of those are different thresholds. So I don't know, I don't have facts to respond to your inquiry, and I would be surprised if there are any cities that have simply eliminated or refused any multifamily housing. But there is, as I said, a sensitivity to that of the legislature, and one of the transportation bills that I will talk about, one of the dialogues we had for a great deal of time over the summer was a debate at the legislature as to whether or not the state should mandate high-density housing along major transportation corridors, with the notion being that if the state's going to invest millions or billions of dollars in these transportation infrastructures, that we ought to make sure that we are maximizing the use of those resources and that funding. That land use element ultimately came out of the transportation bill that I'm going to discuss in just a minute, in part because there weren't any cities who wanted to surrender their local control to state mandate.
Okay. Thanks, Lynn.
We can certainly do
We
some
could
more
go
homework
on about
that.
this, but that's not the point of this
We can
meeting
certainly do some
right
more
now.
homework on that issue if you'd like more, me to gather more
There's,
facts.
Madam Chair, there's one clarification on the reimbursement bill, though. It targets South Salt Lake and Midvale first. We would have to apply for it in subsequent years. Is that accurate?
My understanding, David, you may know more
That
details
is
on this
correct.
than I do. Go ahead.
Yeah, the initial year funding focuses on South Salt Lake and Midvale, and part of the argument or the rationale was, particularly for South Salt Lake, the investment in public safety that they're going to have to make that they don't already have in anticipation of the resource center. And then the second year, the additional cities, Salt Lake City, St. George, and Ogden, thank you, Mayor.
So the initial year is 18-19, July to June?
Yeah,
How's funding?
the state fiscal year, correct.
So that would be, the first year would be this year, July to next July, essentially, and then we could apply once these new centers are open into the city.
And that'll become clear. The Department of Workforce Services will be managing the funding and creating a grant program.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, Lynn,
The
number
second,
two.
second bill that I wanted to highlight is what's listed under transportation issues, and that's Senate Bill 136. That bill did lots and lots of things beyond what I was able to articulate in the memo. The first piece is that it restructured UTA, and I think you've heard a lot about that in terms of going from the existing board to a 3-member commission with a 9-member advisory body, 1 seat of which is reserved for Salt Lake City. The commission is allocated essentially Salt Lake County for 1 seat, Utah and I think Tooele County for a 2nd seat, and then Davis and Weber County, portion of Box Elder County for the 3rd seat. Appointments made by the county, recommendations made by the counties, appointments by the governor. The commission is, they talked about it sort of being like a planning commission, city council model where you have an advisory group that makes recommendations to the decision makers, but those three people will be full-time state employees. And then there's also the proposed renaming of UTA from the Utah Transit Authority to the Transit District of Utah. It just sort of rolls right off your tongue, TDU.
Right. Do those 3 people work under UDOT?
They work, I believe, I don't remember if they work under UDOT or if it's a separate entity, but state employees. The other one is that they create a new transit transportation investment fund. So it's instead of just the state transportation investment fund, TIF, this is a TTIF, an initial amount of $5 million. And beginning in 2019, there will be a local match required, but there will be funding available for transit projects. And that's the where they have added to the criteria the extent of the local match, the amount of economic development that will be realized by the project, and the land use, the initial land use mandates that were in the bill were removed. Third piece is the funding sources, and this is for normal transportation stuff aside from the transit, and that is that, as you're aware, what we referred to as Proposition 1 was proposed, authorized, and then put on the ballot. It failed in Salt Lake and Utah County. This bill would authorize that by either legislative vote of the legislative body, county legislative body, or by putting it back on the ballot, in order to incentivize the counties to pass that tax. The counties are entitled to keep 100% of that revenue for of whatever is generated between now and June 30th of 2019. So the sooner they pass it, the more money they get to keep. But they get to keep 100% of that money during the first year. If they wait until June 2019 to adopt it, they miss out on that window. After June 30th of 2019, the money is divided as per the Prop 1 division. 20% city, 40% city, 40% UTA, 20% county. If by, I think it's 2020, if the county does not adopt it, cities within those counties can adopt it themselves for their own city. If the city adopts it without the county having done so first, the money gets divided 50-50 between the city and UTA. Okay?
You're good at keeping all of that straight.
UTA, I was going to say UTA or TDU.
No, I
but
meant
today it's
all of
UTA.
the-
Okay, so that's the first. That's intended to get Prop 1 passed, at least in Salt Lake County. We don't know what Utah County is going to do. In addition to that, the legislature also created an additional funding source for transit only. That's the 0.2%, and I'm not sure I've got that right, whether it's 20% or 0.2%, but anyway, it's an additional funding source for transit only. It can only be adopted after the counties have adopted all of the other available funding sources, including Prop 1, beginning in, I thought I had a date on that. Well, it expires if not adopted by 2022.
Got it.
And so it's use it or lose it by 2022.
There you go.
Okay? So between the increase in Prop 1 and the increase in the transit tax, that should result in significant revenues coming to Salt Lake City and significant additional transit options for transit projects.
Well,
So-
Lynn, will you contextualize this with our county, and when we'll see this on the ballot then?
Well, it may not,
From
doesn't
the
have to go on the
county.
ballot. The county council
County
can
council
adopt it
can
on their
approve it.
own. So it would behoove us, those of us who live in Salt Lake County, to contact our county legislative body and to encourage them to pass this ASAP.
Then could I ask our staff to help us draft a letter, and I'd love to do a joint letter to the county council from Salt Lake City,
In
making
fact,
that
I spoke to
request.
some people from the county during the session, and they said it might be one of those where they would go around and ask cities if they would pass resolutions supporting it to give them political cover, and I said, I'm sure that could be arranged.
Well, the city council, would you be interested as a council body to pass a resolution?
So,
There we go.
I think there's a concern, I think there's understandably a concern about the county council going out and passing this when the last time they put it on the ballot, the voters said no. So I think they're worried a little bit about that, those political dynamics. But hopefully, and this was part of the purpose of the bill, hopefully the reforms to UTA would give the public more comfort in investing in transit, knowing that there have been more safeguards put into place to protect the use of those funds. So, also there's the statutory process for the allocation of those quarter-to-quarter funds that have been sort of amorphous in the past. We hope that process will result in a little bit more transparency and predictability for the use of and allocation of those funds. They increased the registration fees for alternative fuel vehicles. There was a lot of hubbub about that. The compromise that resulted was a modest modification in the fund, but also a commitment that the funds from those registration fees would be reserved for and used for alternative fuel facilities. So charging
Infrastructure.
stations, things like
Okay.
that. So, provides that corridor preservation funds may be used for transit corridors, not just roadway corridors. And then it authorizes the creation of transportation reinvestment zones, which is sort of an RDA type concept, where you utilize a portion of the value created when you put in a new road or a new transportation project, the value added to those surrounding properties as a mechanism to help fund the project. And that can only be done with the participation and cooperation of the local land use authority, which of course would be Salt Lake City. but we can do that in partnership with UDOT or in partnership with the county or whoever that might be. So there are other transportation bills as well, but that was the most significant one. It had lots and lots of elements that went into it, and I think from a transportation funding perspective was really significant, I hope, you know, assuming we get some of those enacted, in generating new transportation dollars for Salt Lake City. So, any questions about that bill or any of the transportation bills?
Nope.
Okay, then assuming you've looked at the rest of the memo, I will just open it up to questions you have about other legislation. There obviously was lots and lots of other stuff that happened beyond our priority list.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting to the community that we defeated 6 anti-Salt Lake City water bills, 7. And that was a huge win for our community and for the 1 million+ people we provide water to. So kudos to the team on all that work that got done this year.
Yeah, that was a big lift.
Big lift.
There are a couple of other things that I will be preparing that I don't have here for us tonight. One will be a list of the follow-up that is required. Based upon all of what happened, what do we now need to do? Ordinances that need to be changed, agreements that need to be negotiated, encouraging the county to vote the tax, those sort of things. So there'll be sort of a follow-up list. I will prepare that. The other list will be a list of bills that created a fiscal impact for us. Regrettably, most of those negative, but a few of them positive. And so I'll be preparing those as additional sort of supplements to what you've already received, but those have not yet been prepared, so watch for those to come.
Thank you, Lynn. Anything else, Mayor or David, you want to add? I know there's a bit of time and space that's nice to take after the session ends to I'm trying not to be negative here.
Let me just interject
To
here,
analyze.
Madam Chair, and that is, I think, you know, there was certainly some great disappointment, particularly relative to the Northwest Quadrant. But I want to thank the mayor and certainly David and the council for your support. This was, I've been doing this for 14 years. This was unquestionably the most difficult year I have ever seen. Not just for Salt Lake City, but for cities generally. And in years past, when we went to a legislator and said, you know, this bill will have this impact on our local community, they were very responsive to that because they viewed cities as being the people who protect the local community. This year, the mood was very different. And there was some hostility towards cities, certainly towards Salt Lake City. And there was a sense that cities were the problem. Whether it was with affordable housing or economic development or water or transit, cities were the obstacle. And so it became a real challenge to go to the legislators and say, wait, this bill will have this impact. And the response as often as not was, we understand, that's why we're running it, because we intend to fix that or to change that. So it was, as I say, as challenging a session as I have ever seen in the years I've been up there. Notwithstanding that, and notwithstanding one huge disappointment, I think we did very, very well. So I want to thank all of you for your support, and the mayor and the administrative staff. Lots and lots of hands made this possible. Lots of lobbyists, lots of allies in other cities. So thank you all for your support and your help. You know, this was certainly many hands helping to make it possible. The other thing I would add is it's never really over.
Yeah.
And that is, yes, you go through a chapter and the dust settles and you look around and somebody won, somebody lost, and things, you know, you like it or you don't like where things ended up. It's not over. There's another year. The dialogue continues. And whatever is not where we want it today, we ought to work diligently to get it to where we think it ought to be.
And on that
we're certainly anxious to do that.
note, I will encourage my peers to consider accepting a position on the legislative subcommittee later in this meeting. During our announcements, we'll need to reform our coming year's legislative subcommittee. So much to look forward to, right, Lynn?
Yes.
Yeah, especially during the interim, we'll be working on water, transit, all of that still. So, and obviously the Northwest Quadrant.
Great needs, big influence. Come on, people. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
for for being with us. And we will move on to item 8, funding our future, the potential sales tax increase and general obligation bond follow-up discussion. We're happy to have Lindsay Farrar with us. And Lehua Weaver from our office, Siobhan Locke, and Liz Bueller, please come on up. Hi, team. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's been 4 weeks, feels like 3 days.
I'll let you all decide where you want to begin.
To jump right into so we have a report on the public involvement to date, and then we have a list of some issues and questions we thought we could go through, and then I understand that you have our information document with you, and so we wanted to just see if there were any questions. In fact, I'll give a little background on that as well. But should
And
we do
this
quickly?
portion is also in our paper packets, council members.
You want me to be fairly quick?
Oh, we have 45 minutes, so
Okay, I'll talk a
you
little
decide.
slower.
Okay. And Lindsay, make sure you
Oh, okay.
rock star with that
Okay,
mic.
I'll do it. Thanks. Okay, so as I said, we were here 4 weeks ago, and at the onset of this process, and what we heard from the council was we want the outreach for this process to be broad and thorough. And so we've been, in 1 month, we have put a website together, we've had social media communication, we've had a postcard go out to residents, a combination of traditional news media, in-person meetings, and then some public events that I'm going to have Siobhan talk a little bit more about in a minute. So the information is evolving. I mean, we're getting more and more information from the technical experts, and we're adding that to the website as we get it. So I would say keep going there and looking at that information. That's what we're asking the public to do. But the website is sort of the source for everything, and then we've got some other documents as well that I'll talk a little bit about those. So in terms of outreach to date, the website has had 740 unique visitors, and it's really been up for how long, Siobhan? 2 weeks?
Yeah, 2 weeks now that it's been live.
We also have an online survey that's on the website. It's also being sent out via email and lots of other ways, and we've had, as of today, at 3 o'clock, 1,069 people have taken that survey, which I think is a really great sign in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
And Lehua, do you know off the top of your head if we've been able to distribute those through council, through all the district newsletters?
Yes.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Great.
Media stories as of yesterday, we'd had 6 radio stories, 15 TV, and 2 print. There was one in the Tribune on Monday. I don't know if everybody saw that, but they're doing a good job talking about the website, talking about the survey, and the public outreach opportunities. We also have been providing both the council and the mayor's office comment line and email in everything we do. We've only received 8 phone calls to the comment line and 30 comments to the email, which I think is sort of interesting.
So the survey hits, if I could take you back there, do you think that those are coming from the postcards? Or how are people getting to the survey?
I'll bet it's more a matter of the newsletter, the email newsletter, and the email push that Liz's office sent out, because we're sending links to that survey.
And social media as well.
Great.
And I think
Think about where our investments
Yeah.
in the communication strategy pan out for us.
Well, and I know the city has been doing some paid push through social media on that as well.
Yeah, and that's where we saw the big jump, right? Because we had a couple hundred after the postcard, and then the jump with the social and email push is really where we saw the bump.
So in our online survey, if you look at, because we can see results day to day, it was when the postcards started hitting last week, Wednesday and Thursday, that was our first bump. And then the mayor, we had from Civic Engagement, we sent an email blast on Thursday, bump there. And then when mayor's newsletter and all of your newsletters started going over the weekend, that was our third bump.
Great.
Let's see, we can go to the next one. So far, we've been to 13 community council meetings, and Siobhan's office has taken care of almost all of those. We've had 3 business group presentations that I'll talk about. 9, we're also doing just individual stakeholder meetings. with business and community leaders in Salt Lake City. The email blast that Liz just talked about, that went out to 21,700 people altogether. And that was a combination of the council newsletter lists, the Salt Lake City Civic Engagement, our Qualtrics list, and Open City Hall. And that email said, here's the information, here are all the ways you can get engaged. The postcard, as Liz mentioned, dropped last week. That went to 90,000 residents and businesses. And I'm pretty sure everyone's seen that postcard. I wanted to say something about that because we have heard it was a large color postcard, and we did get a few comments about, how much did this cost? Why did it have to be so large? And
I'll take responsibility.
No, well, I'm going
for
to take
that.
responsibility. Because what I think people need to understand is the biggest portion of those costs is postage, is the actual stamp. And that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's little or big or color or black and white. And we feel like something this important needs something large enough to get people's attention. Little postcard means little issue, big postcard means big issue. So we feel like it was an investment worth making.
As an aside, I have heard that the difference in cost between the tiny postcard and the one that was sent was fractional.
Yeah, it's nothing. It's all in the postage.
Yeah.
I think the postage is like 2/3 of the cost of sending out the postcard, so roughly.
Thank you. I'll fall on my sword if you need me to.
Okay. Let's see. Then we've also, the social media outreach is, I think, really starting to take hold. It's been great having the council put things on their personal social media posts. We're doing some paid social, so that's really starting to create some buzz. Business contacts. What you're looking at is a map of all of the things that have happened so far and the things that are planned. So we've had meetings, or we've done one-on-one business visits to the 3rd South Business District and the 9th and 9th Business District. And I think Jen and Hillary spent how many hours?
They spent the majority of Friday, right?
Yeah.
They spent the majority of the day pounding the pavement out there and got pretty far.
And that's a great way to really talk one-on-one with usually small business owners and local business owners about what this may mean for them. And they're getting good feedback and really pretty good support. Bill Knowles is also doing, I'm not clear whether this has happened or not, I'm sorry about that, whether he's done these presentations for River District and Downtown Merchants, or those actually may be later this week.
Yeah, the River District was scheduled, and I'm pretty sure that happened, so yes.
Okay.
The Downtown Merchants, yes.
And then the yellow stars on this map are all of the neighborhoods, the business districts that our team has identified, and they will be getting out into those neighborhoods over the next couple of weeks too. They're going to have to move fast.
We move very fast. We've done most of this in 2 weeks, so we can continue to move that fast.
So in terms of the feedback we've received, I just want to give you sort of an overview of what we feel like we're hearing so far. And you have to remember, this is qualitative. I mean, this isn't a Dan Jones survey. I mean, this is what we're hearing in person and through the comments we're receiving. Overall, people understand the 4 needs that we're presenting. We haven't really had anybody say, I don't believe that we need those things. I mean, they seem to understand that we need transportation, we need affordable housing, we need transit, and public safety. Generally supportive. We also find that the more information they have, the more supportive they are. So as they read the transit plan, or as they read the affordable housing plan, as they get more information about how these needs were identified, they're more supportive. Some of the comments in support are, about our infrastructure needs are serious. We need to take care of this. We need to invest in our future and share the burden. People seem to like the idea of a sales tax that gets everybody to share the burden, including people who don't live in the city. Another thing we've heard a lot is we can support this, but we need accountability. We need to know that the money that is raised is going to be spent for these things. And we want to know, and I think Charlie heard that at the meeting we attended together. We've heard that since then. They want to know, how will you show us that we're solving these problems with the money raised? And then the 4th comment is just this: the city does have a role in affordable housing. This is something we'd like to see the city play a role in. Next are some of the comments in opposition. Those seniors and those on fixed incomes will be impacted. You know, is this fair to those on fixed incomes? We've also heard questions about why can't the revenue be supported by new growth? You know, we talk about in the postcard and on the website about Salt Lake City is doing well. We are seeing a lot of growth in terms of population and businesses and people coming to the city at night for entertainment. So there have been questions about why can't we sustain the needs with that new growth. There's also some concern about the sales tax affecting businesses. What will that impact be? Some comments about housing is just getting too expensive. You know, no one wants to see a property tax increase. And people will sometimes say that. And then the other comment is about other ways to fund this. What about user fees? And then there are just more questions than anything. And so I wanted to list those, because this may be a good topic of discussion for the council. So this, why can't revenue be supported by new growth? Why not increase user fees? What will the impact be on retail?
And commercial.
Yeah, and commercial, yeah, commercial property tax. How will the road projects be prioritized? Will this be enough funding to really make a difference? It's funny, every once in a while someone will say, the needs seem huge, this doesn't seem like it seems like a drop in the bucket. And then there's just still some confusion about the two revenue streams, and we're doing our best to communicate that different needs require different types of funding. But that's still a little bit of a question mark for people. Then the next page. Oh, I'm sorry, this is Siobhan's.
Oh, okay, that's me. So we've done a lot of outreach already in the couple of weeks that we've been out and about. And then we have upcoming, we still have tonight, we're set up outside these very doors to provide some information, hopefully for those coming to participate in tonight's council meeting and to participate in the hearing. So we wanted to provide some additional information to make sure we're building that awareness tonight. And then also tomorrow we have 2 public workshops at the Unity Center, a midday and an evening session I think, I want to just make note about, we've developed the materials and we've developed the format of that workshop to be responsive to what we've heard to date, meaning that people want that additional information. They want to know, if we give you this money, how will you spend it? And so we've tried to staff it and build materials that help to further that conversation. We will reiterate some of the information that people have already seen, but we want to further that conversation with discussion with staff. Then we have the Newsmaker breakfast planned for April 11th at the Gardner Institute. Then we have small business outreach that Lindsay already touched on, that we're just going to keep reaching out to those various business districts. The online survey will continue through the planned vote. And then community council meetings, we're just getting out every time there is one, we're there. So we're continuing that cycle. And I believe we're on track to hit everyone except for maybe one.
Yes.
Yeah. And then we have the public hearing that you all have scheduled on the night of the potential vote, and then ahead of us, even more if we move into phase 2 for the bond. So quite a bit still planned and quite a bit has happened.
Liz, can we pull up the messaging document?
It should be up on, yeah.
I think while they do that, the one thing I would add is we talked about a lot of qualitative, but there is, the quantitative of the survey that went out before even we were on board to look at some of these things, and then our survey as well. So it's a mix that we're getting in, because I know several council members asked for that quantitative, and I don't want it to seem that we've ignored that request, because it is, we have numbers rolling in as well as just comments.
So hopefully you've all had time to look at this briefly. So let me explain. This is a document that we use to collect information, and we use it as the basis for the information that goes on the website and the fact sheets. We also hope that it's something that will help you as you're out talking in the community. So we wanted to make sure that that you saw the most recent version of this as we're tweaking our facts and making sure that it's all correct. So basically it's organized around four key information buckets. And the first is just the need. You know, why are we even talking about this? And it's because Salt Lake City is growing and experiencing challenges of that growth. The second messaging bucket is about the 4 areas of critical need. And that's what we've been out talking about with the public. We're going to be spending a lot of time tomorrow having conversations about those. And the 4 areas of needs are those improved street conditions, greater housing opportunities, better transit service, and better neighborhoods, increased neighborhood safety and security. So we had a big planning meeting about a week and a half ago and sat down with the technical experts and from the city and talked about what is the existing condition in each one of these areas, what's desired condition, what's the funding gap, and then what would this proposal, what would an increase in funding accomplish for us? And so that's what we've outlined for these 4 areas. So if you look at improved street conditions, you know, the existing condition can be found in the pavement survey. You know, 64% of our roads are in poor condition. The desired condition is that we really need about $20 million a year for the next 10 years to completely rebuild the worst roads, but we're only getting about 5. Then the gap is shown to be about $20 million a year for new roads and infrastructure, and $5 million a year for road maintenance. So we've gone through and done that for each one of those areas. Are there any questions on those before I go to the next message? So then we get to the information about revenue sources. And this has been the tricky one. We've had to talk to people about the fact that you can't use, there's not a single solution here. We have to have 2 different types of revenue sources for infrastructure and services. So we've tried to explain that the 2 opportunities before the council and the administration right now are an increase in sales tax and a potential general obligation bond. And we give some of the details there. And then we also talk about what we would fund, right now what the plan is for funding through a sales tax opportunity. And the general bond obligation our general obligation bond is a more complicated process because we have to go through a whole nother public involvement process where we prioritize those projects. So that would follow next month, really, beginning next month. And then message 4 is always about public involvement and making sure that people understand that there are lots of ways. It's a fairly short period of engagement, but there are lots of ways to get involved. And so we just want to make sure people understand those.
And that's been our primary message, actually, is please come have these conversations, because that's where the understanding is built with these one-on-one conversations.
So council members, my hope for this discussion is that we can get consensus on whether or not there's agreement on this general direction that's happening. And if we need to talk about the 4 general areas that are being contemplated for funding, this is our time to do that. Charlie? Yes. Councilmember Luke, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So generally, I think this is a good direction. You know, it is a unique opportunity. I've had a couple of opportunities now to present with Lindsay at different community council meetings, and the public understands, the public gets what we're, you know, that there is a need and that we're trying to do something. The only concern that I have, and it's not as much of a concern as, you know, a question on priority, is how we arrived at these 4 items to go and present to the public. And I know that I know there was a poll that was done. Some of that information was based on that. There's also information that's based on general need. So I understand that. I am concerned, though, that when we look at the sales tax option, I mean, this is the one opportunity that the city's had to really look at distributing the increase across a broader group than just Salt Lake City residents. And when you look at the needs that we have in the city, you know, we're very short on tools that we can utilize to fund these different options. Streets has been underfunded for decades, largely because it's less interesting and it's easy to prioritize things higher, and to either to prioritize things higher, or, you know, when there is money available, we try to do a little bit for a lot, and we just continue to dig the pothole deeper and deeper and deeper, and that's where we are right now. With this option, you know, I look at the four options that we're talking about, and really the only option where we do have other revenue sources that we could be looking at that we're not, or that we have not, is housing. I'm not opposed to the city funding housing. I'm fully supportive of that, to the point where, as the RDA board last year, we prioritized $21 million to be used exclusively for that. That is one option that I think we can continue to look at. That was money that we appropriated for affordable housing at that time. But one of the things, and we talked about it a little bit here, and this is a failed opportunity also for decades, is the amount of city-owned property that we have that we can utilize for affordable housing. We talk about, you know, we talk about property owners downtown land banking. We are the most guilty at land banking, whether it's the Utah Theater, whether it's the Fleet Block. We have great ideas. We talk about wanting to do stuff, yet we sit on the main resource that we have. And I'm concerned that when we go out to the public and have this unique opportunity, that we're going to divert $5 million a year to housing, when we can be looking at funding, or at putting far more than that into housing if we utilize existing land that we have and figure out, you know, how we can better utilize the RDA tool that we have. Because what this does, and I understand that, you know, with the general obligation bond, that's going to be, you know, arriving at $20 million a year roughly to go into infrastructure. But I think $5 million, I would much prefer that we pull the housing off of this, out of this discussion, have $10 million in sales tax go to streets. The other things I think make sense because we don't have other funding tools available. We have funding tools for housing. We're just not doing it. So let's do it. Let's figure that out. And, you know, instead of just doing the bare minimum of streets, the sooner we fix those, the sooner that we deal with that project, then we can go back, and if we want to put more money into housing, if we want to put more money into parks or whatever else, we can do that. But if we don't take a big step on infrastructure maintenance when we have the opportunity to do so, we are not doing our jobs, and we're letting the public down, because we are no better than, you know, everybody else who's sat in these seats for decades. If we continue to, you know, do the bare minimum necessary to do this when we have an opportunity to really make a difference.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. I hope this discussion will continue. Thank you, Charlie, for bringing this up. And you're right that this is our first kind of bite at the conversation of the 4 items. And you're absolutely right that they're not news to anybody. They're not news to residents, that they're existing issues and deficits that we have not had another option to really address until this sales tax option. And the GO bond for different things we own. So my opinion is that with the general obligation bond opportunity and the sales tax option, that we can, it's not either or, that we can do $25 million in the first 4 years towards streets, 20 million from the sales tax option approximately, and 5 million.
Either way.
I'm sorry, thank you, 20 million from the general obligation and 5 for the maintenance portion. which puts us 5 million over the $20 million need annually, so to speak. And then when that general obligation bond, if it were to pass, is exhausted, then we shift back into the sales tax for, and this can and should be planned out for transparency and accountability's sake for our taxpayers. But I don't think it's either or. And just as you're saying, I agree that we have this chance right now to finally address this need for streets. I think that even the advocates who would love to reprimand us for all sorts of affordable housing deficits over the years would agree that this body and this mayor are the best shot at affordable housing, long-term funding, that this affordable housing community who's been advocating for this has seen in decades. So I do feel like this is an incredible opportunity for us to secure that. You're absolutely right that we have more assets than we're acting on, and we had that discussion beginning today with the surplus land disposition ordinance that would require us to look at using our surplus land for affordable housing. And that is one great step. Will there be another $21 million? Not in the RDA couch cushions, so to speak, not anytime soon, but you're absolutely right that there's other RDA allocation options that we should continue to invest in. But I think, as Amy alluded to in an earlier part of our agenda, that this body is not going to last forever, and those allocations from an RDA standpoint, I think, are less secure over time than our commitments through the sales tax option. They should all be used in tandem, and to what degree we invest in the affordable housing is for us to figure out over time. So anybody else, please want to chime in on these 4 priority issues that have been identified, and if you share concerns to one degree or another with Charlie on affordable housing. How's transit feeling for you? Councilmember Wharton.
Just for going forward, I think that your presentation did a good job of pointing out what I see most in terms of opposition is members of the public not understanding why we don't have all of these other funding options available, and not understanding that the state legislature has really limited what the city how we can raise funds, and then how we can use those funds. So if I could ask for anything more, it would just be more of an explanation, because that's a really hard to explain. That whole it's an education process, and that is, I think, been the steepest curve for the people that I've spoken with. So I wanted to give you that feedback. In terms of including affordable housing, I think that I know that there are other options available, and that we still need to pursue, but this is an issue that was really important to so many people during this last election cycle, and I think that that the public is willing to make this investment, and I think that that's worthwhile, and that we shouldn't. I think we have to capture that while we can. As Aaron said, that I don't know that the other options that we can pursue. I mean, I think that's all the better, but I'm in favor of including affordable housing. I think that it's pretty essential. I think we're at crisis level right now, and I think that most of our residents understand that. So.
Member Kitchen.
Well, I have a lot of ideas, and this money won't cover all of them, unfortunately. But, I feel really strongly about affordable housing broadly speaking. I would like to see what kind of feedback we receive at the end of the day, and hopefully allow that to guide us when we're talking about affordable housing. I would be in favor of it, but I kind of want to leave that asterisk there because I don't know what that looks like yet. One thing I do feel really passionate about, and something that the residents, as I'm going out to community council meetings or talking to folks at the farmers market or just on the street, they're really jazzed about the prospect of having increased transit service. And as we grow, we're going to have to add additional housing units, and we're going to become a denser community. I think this is our one shot at actually bringing on Salt Lake City specific transit options, whether that's increased service or frequency, or east-west connections that really matter to this body and I think the community at large. And so I feel like we must do something with the transit option on the table here.
And we will get to I appreciate that, and the sorting of how much, looking at the funding need and the recommendations, we don't have to sort out today. We don't even have to sort out before the 17th, but it's good to have these early conversations. Councilmember Johnston?
I think we do need to do some sorting, though. I mean, if people are going to be on board, they want specifics, and I know we have to balance that, but we can't make promises to everybody without being clear what we can and can't fulfill. So yes, and we do need to have that pretty quickly. I have a question about, is $8 million enough to get the master transit plan implemented the way we need it done? As well as just specific outcomes for these things. I think there's ways we can track street maintenance, both visually on a map for people. I think there's ways we can look at better transit service. It's pretty easy to quantify, have we done this or not, 15-minute intervals on these major routes, hours, those kind of things. My other question, though, is about the increased neighborhood safety, and perhaps that's something to be sorted out later, but what does that mean? And how do we know we've done it? Still a lingering question for me. The question I have is rainy day fund, is that general fund balance?
I'm sorry, could you repeat
The rainy day fund piece in here, $3 million a year, proposed idea, is that directly into the fund balance for the city?
that was? Yes, that's the standing city policy that roughly 1%, and I apologize, finance could answer this better, but 1% goes into reserves.
It actually is this thing where when our revenues increase, that 10% minimum required by state law increases. So Mary Beth helpfully reminded us that we can't forget that, as we don't really have, $30 million to spend. We have 30 million minus 3, because it's 10% of that has to come immediately off the top.
So that doesn't necessarily get us to a healthy fund
It
balance
does not
itself.
increase fund balance.
Yes.
It helps us so we're not losing in our position by increasing our revenue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so I think we also need to be clear with people about how we're going to use these funds, because we've committed to 50 new police officers. If this is going to pay for an existing commitment we've made already, we need to draw the line in the sand and say, where does that end in our current budget? Because we could take this money and use it for current needs that are unfunded. And I've been saying publicly, look, I don't think it should go to our current budget unfunded needs. This should go to new things we can quantifiably say we've done them or not. So we need to be clear in our public safety piece here about what we are and aren't committing to with this money.
Councilmember Fowler?
Thank you. I guess it seems to me, and first off, thank you for all of this and all of the work that you guys have done very quickly. I'm sure there's been lots of sleepless nights for everyone involved, so thank you, because it is incredibly important. And I look at these numbers and I agree that today we don't have to decide things, but we kind of need to be thinking about them. And it's almost as if it's almost as if I feel that we need to prioritize our priorities here, right? And clearly there may be some differences, but I think it's a discussion that we need to have, because what's interesting as I sit here and kind of like listen to each of the other council members talk about what the priorities are. I mean, nobody's mentioned street maintenance as their like number one, and it is my number one priority because it's everything that my residents talk about, right?
I pretty much did.
Well, you like to repeat everything I say, so I figured I would take a turn to repeat what you say, Charlie. Right, but there are these different priorities, and I think that, I mean, I think we have to start looking and making those sort of really maybe hard decisions of prioritizing the priorities. And I think, again, we're sort of our first chance to all sit down and look at this and grapple with it. But that's where I'm at right now. That $5 million doesn't seem like a lot of money for street maintenance, right? But I don't know. That's just my sort of general thought. And again, thank you.
And I don't know if everybody's had the time to read this. It's still quite general, but that would double our street maintenance facility, our crew, our equipment, everything. So that would increase the lane miles maintained.
It would double it from 75 lane miles to 155 lane miles a year.
And I think at our next discussion, we would love to hear from Lisa Schaefer or whomever wants to talk to us about if that's enough. Does that meet the maintenance need per year? And to Amy's question is, what is that actual need? I found it really interesting too that the only section in here, back to affordable housing, that said the need is this, but they're only requesting half of it, was affordable housing. And all of the others was like, here's the funding gap filled. Funding gap filled. No, when we look at the $20 million. Oh, you're to talk about the general obligation bond. Yes, there's an assumption that the GO bond would pass. So we have to make that decision on the sales tax option long before the general obligation bond gets a vote to the people. So we get to answer the question. Anything else, council members? Councilmember Luke, you started. Do you want to jump back in at all?
Sure. I mean, I do think that, you know, the direction that we're going is great. I'm not going to repeat what Amy said because, just because. No, but I do think that prioritization is important and that we're going to have that discussion. And today is probably not the day to do it, but I hope that we're all thinking this through. As far as infrastructure goes, again, I mean, what I'm concerned about is that elected officials always use infrastructure as justification to increase taxes, and it might go there for a little bit, and then it immediately is siphoned off somewhere else. We saw that with the last time the property taxes were increased 4 years ago. I think there is some real concern that I have heard that could happen again. And I do think that, you know, while, you know, I have I am optimistic that the GO bond would pass if it's on there for infrastructure. It's an assumption. And again, this is a rare opportunity that we have that we don't have other funding sources for public safety. We just don't. I mean, Aaron, you and I have gone through, you know, budget after budget, you know, trying to figure out how we can pull more money in for public safety. It's not there. Infrastructure, it's not there either. Transit, it's not there. Housing is the one area, and again, believe me, I'm very, very supportive of housing, but I do think that there are other tools that we have available, whereas with these other three priorities, we don't. And the other thing is, to Andrew's point, housing is going to be the most difficult thing to track in how the money is being spent. We can put it into a pot, we can say this is what we're going to do with it, but it's going to be very, very hard. There's not a lot of predictability on how that will be spent because it can go for one project, it could go for multiple. We just don't know. And so I think if we're looking for direct accountability to taxpayers and on what we're going to do, the easiest thing would be to track infrastructure funding because you know what you're doing with it. Public safety, you know how many officers you're going to be hiring. Transit, you know what north-south or east-west routes are not in existence. You can track that. Housing, it's muddier. And I agreed, Chris, I do think that the public's, willing to move forward on this. So let's exhaust every other option that we have, and utilize, the resources that we have for the ones that we can't, that there are no other resources for.
Councilmember Johnston?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think with the housing discussion is also interesting because in our other discussions about the, say, RDA money for 21 million, we had a policy discussion saying we're targeting 40% AMI and below, which is a very specific population of the city. We haven't had a discussion about what this would do because most of our resources have been said we're going to allocate that towards the lowest income levels, but that doesn't necessarily touch anybody in the middle. And when we talk about affordable housing in the public, there's not a clarification about what that means. Does that mean my neighbor next door who has a job and
We did approve
So
the
forth.
Growing SLC housing plan just recently, and that's what this is actually talking about, putting the money toward. So it is quite specific, actually.
so targeting, and then we have to be very clear with the citizens then, when we talk about affordable housing, what this is going to do, exactly what Charlie's point about how is this going to affect their experience in the city, because I think the bigger levers that I'm looking at are the transit option, which means we look at our parking and the overhead costs of developing in the city, zoning issues, and those kind of things, which could really have massive impacts about the number of units citywide. So I'm a little trying to be careful about figuring out how this money would go towards affordable housing and what the outcome would be that people would see.
So it sounds like we need, at our next discussion, at a work session, to get much more clarity from Housing and Neighborhood Development and whatever team around that wants to bring that clarity to us. Also, while I do think, as Charlie's talked about, that there are a bunch of tools that we can leverage toward more affordable housing, a lot of them, even like the surplus land discussion that we just had earlier, are really administrative. When it boils down to it, we don't get to get rid of that land. We don't execute those contracts. That's not the council. And that $21 million that this body put together and put specifically toward that 40% and below, it moved fast. I mean, we're spending it. It's gone. The money is the tool to make things happen. And we can put administrative tools in place, and with the RDA, we can maybe get $2-3 million a year going toward this. I don't think it's enough. I don't think that money is enough, and I don't feel as confident for any future administration even to necessarily execute on all of the administrative improvements we're talking about making. Money moves. So we can make those administrative improvements, we can do those ordinance changes, but we're not going to see doors until we attach money to it, and I don't think our RDA money is enough. So we're going to have some great discussions about this. We do have a time sensitive now.
One quick comment on that. I do think that, that there is something that you did leave out, and it is, using our budgetary discretion to tie the administration to legislative intent. And there are things that I think we can do in the coming budget where if it is the council's intent, if it is our legislative intent that we look at utilizing surplus property, maybe there's something that we can do budgetarily that ties it to it.
Perhaps, and then I look at the fleet block and the way it's sat there for administration after administration, and the inability for this body, anybody, whoever's sitting on the council, we got no leverage there.
Agree. So let's
And
give
that's-
ourselves leverage.
That's disappointing. Okay, so we need to wrap up, but can I ask for a straw poll right now, as we have people in the hallway looking at these 4 issues right now, with people from these departments answering questions right now? I'd like to get us some general consensus that at this point, we're moving ahead with these discussions, and the priorities and the way that they filter out based on the funding gaps. We are about to have those discussions in our upcoming meetings. Are we okay with the way it's going right now? Can I get a thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay, there you go. Don't change anything yet. Thank you. We know you have lots of work to do. We'll see you in the hallway.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're moving on to our first board appointment. which is, and we apologize, we're a couple minutes behind, to the Art Design Board, Nancy Rivera. If Nancy's in the audience, please come on up. Welcome.
Thank you.
And these microphones, you really got to speak into them for all of the TV viewers at home.
Okay.
Will you give us a brief introduction of yourself and what interests you about the Art Design Board?
Sure. My name is Nancy Rivera. I've been a resident of Salt Lake for 18 years. I graduated with an MFA in photography in 2016 from the University of Utah, and I'm currently an artist in residence at UMOCA, and we'll have a solo show there in the fall. I'm also the development coordinator at Utah Film Center and a board member of Artisan Mexico.
Wonderful background that makes you quite relevant to the discussions at the Art Design Board. Council members, any questions, comments? Councilmember Kitchen.
Hi, thank you for your interest and for showing up here before us today. I think you'll be great, first of all. But just for us, would you describe your individual art style so that we can get an idea of what kind of artist you are and what corner of the art world you come from?
Sure. I'm a contemporary artist. I make work about the idea that comes with it more than what the work may look like. It's not so much about the beauty of the work, but more about what it makes you, what's the thought that it provokes in the viewer. So I'm interested in bringing that side of my knowledge and skills into the board, and also encouraging other contemporary artists that I know in the community that would be good in this public art program.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great, thank you. Any other council comments? Thank you for your willingness to serve on this board, Ms. Rivera. And we will go through the advice and consent process during our formal meeting. You don't have to stick around. You can tune into Channel 17 and toast yourself when we get to the consent portion of our agenda. But we thank you for your willingness to serve and bring your talent to our city in a new way,
Thank you.
another way. Thank you.
Thanks for your consideration.
All right, Matthew Sybil, come on up. We've got a board appointment to the Transportation Advisory Board. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Madam Chair.
Would you mind doing the same, introducing yourself? I think we kind of know why you're interested in transportation.
I'd be happy to, thank you. So my name is Matt Sybil, and I'm the Government Relations Director with the Utah Transit Authority. I know most of you. I haven't had a chance to engage with a couple of new council members, so I want to be able to do that at the right point. I've been involved with transportation my entire career. I've been with Utah Transit Authority for about 10 years. I started out, I'm an engineer, civil engineer by training. I started out my career at UTA developing and building the airport tracks line, and I spent a lot of time in this room negotiating with the city council back in the day, and a great product arose from those negotiations. I've run our planning department, and now I'm in our government relations office. And like I said, I'm a passionate person when it comes to transportation. I'm a user of transit and biking, and I'll maybe just leave it at that, Madam Chair.
Council, questions, comments? We know you that well, I guess, Matt. We appreciate your commitment to transit expansion and riding a bike around the city. It's easy to spot you riding to UTA. And he's a resident of District 5, so he's got an uphill battle there. We appreciate your multifaceted, multimodal transportation intentions. Councilmember Kitchen?
I'm sorry, I just had a last minute thought. You brought up the fact that we always see him on his bike. I really appreciate that you practice what you preach, and so thank you for that. And I think that you will serve well in this capacity because obviously you're dedicated to Salt Lake, but your personality is really unique in that I think you diffuse people really easily. You bring a really classic diplomatic style to engagement, and so I'm really excited to have you, and I'm honored that you are interested in serving the city again in this capacity, so thank you.
Thank you. If I could just mention really quickly, Madam Chair, I was here for the previous discussion about streets and transit, and I know UTA really looks forward to being a part of the discussion, I think on the 17th, later this month, about
Yes.
that very topic. So thank you for considering that issue, and it's a great topic.
Thanks, Matt. And like I said to Ms. Rivera, you don't have to stick around.
Even if I want to?
You may. It is a public meeting. It will be toward the end of the meeting.
Thank you.
Channel 17 is always there for you. We are going to postpone our consideration of Alan Gallegos. He needed to reschedule, so we'll go on to item 12. Darren Piccoli, come on up for our Business Advisory Board.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Would you give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure. I'm Darren Piccoli, co-owner of the State Room at 638 South State Street, and involved in various other downtown projects, also the talent buyer for Live at the Eccles concert series at the new Eccles Theater, and have been a resident of Salt Lake City since 1998.
Me too.
Yeah, very good. Cheers to that.
Councilmember Fowler.
I just want to say I've known Darren for a long time now, and I was really excited when I got the transmittal and saw it, and I was like, oh, I'm going to just ask him all these tough questions, but then I can't come up with any because I know you so well, and I'm really excited about this, and
Thank you.
All of the work that you do with our arts community throughout the city. And I think one of the things that, I know Darren is Spike, so Spike and Matt's, that you guys do, though, is to make sure to really try to reach the various facets of our different communities and pick something for everyone and not just have one genre. But
Yeah.
so I appreciate that because I know how much diversity means to you guys as you're looking at the city and what you're doing within our city. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm excited.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Kitchen.
Thank you for your interest in serving in this board. It's an important board. Can you talk to me with this body about some of the concerns that you have as a small business owner and somebody that has an interest in seeing this industry thrive, especially the arts and performance industry? What are some of the barriers or hurdles that you see, and what role might you be able to play on the Business Advisory Board to help illuminate that to the city itself?
Sure. I've been an entrepreneur, small business owner since I moved here, and have been involved in entertainment and music since the Olympics really is full-fledged time. Opening the State Room in 2009 was eye-opening, dealing with city planning and zoning, and then just underlying laws and disadvantages that are sometimes afforded to businesses that have alcohol licensing. So while I have seen the council over the years definitely be pretty progressive, some of the laws that were on the books when we first started didn't even allow us to apply for a liquor license, and they were city laws, not state laws, and those were eventually changed to allow us to do that. But I went to a few of the BAB meetings invited by Angela Brown, and I thought seeing a lot of other small businesses expressing what might seem like smaller concerns, whether it's type of businesses going in next door or lack of businesses going in next door, having people sharing the same frustrations, I think, puts more weight to it for the council and the city and just people in general. And, we're boots on the ground all the time. So for us, we do a lot of different types of events at the State Room. And so, every busy night we have 300 different people that walk through that door. And so we hear their concerns as well that I think will be helpful to voice to the advisory board and then obviously relay back to you.
Councilmember Luke.
Yeah, I don't have any questions for Darren. More of a selfish request. Just keep booking great shows, please. That's all I
Just
ask.
keep coming because, they wouldn't be there without the audience.
Deal.
I know that's corny, but it's true. I think it's a unique opportunity. And I think I can bring a different perspective because I think a lot of businesses are more direct service oriented. We're like almost a backwards kind of business, you know, we're selling it before it happens. So it's like, you know, buying your meal and then a month later getting it. And so there's a couple different facets, whether it's security or traffic, you know, again, parking, neighbors, that I think affect us a bit different than other local small businesses.
Anything else, council members? All right. Darren, same for you. You don't have to stick around.
Okay. I can't anyway, but thank you.
Okay. And thanks for your willingness to serve.
Yeah, no problem. You're welcome.
All right, on to Kestrel Leidke. Come on up, our other Business Advisory Board appointment. Thanks for being here, Kestrel.
Thanks for having me.
Although we have your application as we do all the others, will you do the same and give us a little intro into why, I think we can guess why you're interested in this board, but.
Yeah. My name's Kestrel Leidke. I own the Tin Angel down here near Pioneer Park. We've been there 11 years. I am interested in being on this board. I did 4 years on the RAC, the Redevelopment Agency Committee, and it was enlightening and interesting, but maybe not really good use of my skills and expertise. And I feel like this committee would be a little better fit for me. I liked the question that you asked him. What do you think you could bring to this board? I would hope that I could say that I have helped to increase the profile of the area that my business is in. Sometimes I feel that way, sometimes I don't. It is an odd little neighborhood. But in as much as I maybe have been an anchor business, I have really been through the ringer in that regard. And I think I have come out with some knowledge that I would hope to share.
Thank you. Councilmember Kitchen.
Personal question on your business. How is the neighborhood? It's undergone quite a few changes the last few years, and how do you feel about it right now?
Right now, I feel really positive about it. When Operation Rio Grande first started, it was probably our roughest few months. There were about 6 months there where we really nearly went under. And I think that was a lot because of the area being in the news so much negatively, more than anything else. But things seem to have calmed down, and it just seems to have come back, and maybe even stronger. Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Fowler?
I again just want to say, Kestrel, when I saw your name on the list, I was very excited.
Thank you.
Tin Angel happens to be my favorite restaurant in town, so. But again, going to something I said to Darren, I also know how heavily involved you are in both, not just the Pioneer Park area in trying to uplift it, but throughout with the Utah Arts Festival, and how important kind of being a part of the community and the fabric of the community, and the fact that, you know, even during those really rough times, you guys haven't moved out of that area.
Yeah.
I think it really is something to be said for your commitment to being a part of the community, and I really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
I love the gorgonzola gnocchi. If you haven't tried it, I licked the bowl. It's sort of silly, but
We can order
thanks.
takeout for dinner.
Yes. Thank you very much, Kestrel.
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else, council members? Kestrel, you're awesome, and you would be great on any of our boards, but I think you're absolutely right that you have a ton of relevant experience to bring to this one in particular.
Thanks.
And hopefully, after you do 4 years, is that what your term is here?
I think so.
Yeah, like it's a prison term. I did 4 years on the rack. and
Yeah,
for-
I like
that-
it that the other one's called the rack. It's 4 years on the rack.
Then we'll find another border commission to put you on after this. Hopefully, it doesn't take you through the ringer, so to speak.
Right.
Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
willingness
All
to
right.
serve
Yeah.
again.
Thank you. And I'm not going to stick around. I got the message.
Go on, get some dinner.
Have fun, though.
Thank you. Our last board appointment tonight is Kimberlyn Maines. Please come on up, and this is for an appointment to the Human Rights Commission. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Will you follow the same shtick?
I will. It's a tough act to follow here, but since I'm the last one wrapping it up,
Nice to meet all of you. My name's Kim Maines. I'm a vice president at Vivint Smart Home. I run their technology organization. I recently moved to Salt Lake City from Seattle in July, and I'm an active supporter member of the HRC, Equality Utah, as well as Women in Technology. So really working to get a better pipeline of women in technology and leadership positions.
Fabulous. Okay, Councilmember Kitchen.
Welcome to Salt Lake.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How is it treating you?
Hey, I keep coming back, right? It's been great. It's been really good, actually. One of the things that I probably like the most is it feels like a really small community where hopefully I can make an impact.
Do you live within the city?
I do. I live in District 6.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for jumping feet first and your interest in serving in this capacity. We're happy to have you.
Absolutely.
Councilmember Wharton.
Hello. So I got my start in politics on the Human Rights Commission and really enjoyed serving my time there. I did 2 terms. But the commission is one that has a really flexible charge, I think, by statute. And you can really take it a lot of different places. What issue or where would you like to see, and how do you see your experience in with your technology background? And could you just flesh that out a little bit more? You kind of touched upon it.
Sure. I think I would highlight 3 areas that are probably very personal to me. Obviously, my wife and I moving to this community, making sure that we're well represented. Also, my wife being an immigrant, making sure that, you know, everyone is afforded equal opportunities is very near and dear to my heart. And third, just the women in technology. I think that starts very young, so creating a good connection. Obviously, in my profession, struggling to get women in leadership positions, but it starts a lot earlier than that. So making good connections, I think, making sure that that STEM is open to young girls at a very young age, so actively involved in Girls Who Code, starting in grade school, middle school, getting them involved to know that there is a career. It doesn't just have to be this scary thing that only boys do. And so really like working a good pipeline from the educational systems early on to making everyone know that technology is thriving here in the Salt Lake Valley. And, you know, I spent the majority of my career in the Silicon Valley in San Jose with Adobe, and moving out here and just attracting more talent.
Great. Well, I think those are all really exciting. Those 3 areas are all really exciting. And so I just want to encourage you to take all 3 and run with it. And I think you'll be great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you'll be a great fit.
Anything else, council members? Well, Kim, thank you for, as Councilmember Kitchen said, jumping in feet first into the city. It's a big little place.
Yeah.
And we welcome you with open arms. And as I said to Kestrel, hopefully this won't be your last committee or board or engagement with Salt Lake City as an entity. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet all of you.
Thank you. That is the conclusion of our agenda and takes us to our standing items with our report and announcements from the executive director. And tonight it is Jennifer Bruno.
Okay, first we'll go to discussion about the July meeting dates. Typically, we only have 2 meeting dates in July. We, just to hold options at the beginning of the year, we had 2 extra dates listed as tentative, causing some to think that we were meeting on every Tuesday in July. So if we wanted to check and see if council members had any preferences. One, to confirm that you did not want to meet on July 3rd, which is the date before, it should be on your electronic packet, sorry, the announcements. I mean, if we want to meet on July 3rd, it's totally up to you guys. Thinking that you could either swap one of the tentative dates for one of the other dates. Sometimes people like to group the dates so that they're sort of in a 2-week span, so that there's sort of a larger break to accommodate summer travel or whatever. Anyway, thoughts?
I obviously don't want to meet on July 3rd, but I mean, after our conversation today with Stadler and potential needs out there, I know their deadline is July 3rd, so
Okay.
maybe we just I don't know.
Just not touch it, maybe.
Maybe just leave it
for
blank,
another month.
you know? Yeah, just.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
And I would prefer to meet on the 3rd than on holiday than on the 17th.
Okay. Okay. And the chair, before she stepped out, said that she would rather meet on the 31st instead of the 17th also. So, okay, so maybe we'll repost this as an announcement maybe in a month. Well, maybe we knew a little bit more about Stadler and just kind of confirm with you guys. Okay, and then the legislative subcommittee. So by right or by policy, the council chair and the RDA board chair are members of the legislative policy committee. In some years, the chairs delegate to another member, but in this case, I think both chairs are going to continue to serve. So then the rest of the council selects the third member of the legislative subcommittee. And fair warning, there is a meeting tomorrow at noon of the legislative subcommittee.
Does anybody want to serve?
I don't know that Aaron does.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay.
I think we should.
Okay, we can do that.
I
We can
think
have
we
announcements
need
after the formal
to.
meeting if we want.
Okay.
If that's
Charlie,
easier.
do you have do you have the ability to go another year or desire? Are you also more than happy to?
I'm more than happy to serve as well.
Oh, okay.
But so I would say, if you have not served on the committee, do it.
I'm happy to serve on the committee.
Sure, Aaron doesn't want to? Or is
I'm
it-
not
you're
sure,
not sure?
but I told her that if she didn't want to, she could delegate it to me.
Oh, okay, cool.
But I don't know if she.
So I know Amy wants to, and if you're interested, then
Well,
I know
don't-
Charlie's great at it, but it sounds like he's also deferring. So
It'll be a change
Uh,
for us. I'll be texting.
Maybe we can revisit this announcement after the formal meeting.
Okay.
You guys can have a chance to discuss.
Yeah.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah.
Okay.
When
So
do we pick it during the formal meeting?
you don't necessarily, but there's a meeting at noon tomorrow. So there's a little bit of an urgency in sort of selecting who's on the committee just so that we know who to invite to the meeting at noon tomorrow.
Right.
Okay, then not
I-
answer that.
Yeah, I committed to being at Sorensen tomorrow at that time, but
Well.
I could maybe rearrange.
Okay.
Yeah. You're currently on it, all right? Okay.
Okay.
So where did we end up?
Everyone's on the committee. No.
We're all on it.
We're gonna talk over dinner and then have it after formal meeting?
We'll revisit in public after the formal meeting.
but it sounds like for tomorrow, we're moving forward with the committee
Maybe
as
the
a-
current
the
committee.
current committee, and then we
Yeah.
can figure it out next time.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So that would be Aaron, Derek, Andrew. Is that the current committee?
Charlie, Derek, and
Charlie, Derek, Andrew. Sorry, Charlie, Derek.
And Aaron's on for the meeting tomorrow as a placeholder, so
Okay.
if Charlie can't come, maybe we'll just let Aaron come tomorrow as the
Great.
chair of the council.
Okay, so that's how we'll make it work for tomorrow, and then we'll figure it out going forward. Thanks for your patience. That's it. And then dinner is downstairs